The game of basketball has been around for over 100 years, and during that passage of time, many developments have happened that have softened up the sport and the competitors involved. In this video, we're traveling back in time, further and further into the past, as the league simultaneously becomes more and more barbaric, to the extent that some of you may find hard to believe. Let's start in somewhat recent history, which is the early 2000s. For most of NBA history, the offensive 3-second violation rule has been in place, but the defensive 3-second violation did not exist until the 2001 to 2002 season. As most of you know, the defensive 3-second violation is when the defender is in the painted area for at least 3 seconds, while not actively guarding an opponent, which will result in a technical free throw for the opposing team. Before the year 2001, NBA centers could simply camp under the basket, providing constant rim protection for their team. But with the new 3-second rule, centers had to be constantly moving in and out of the paint to avoid a violation. Less time being spent in the paint meant that less dunks and layups were being contested at the rim. Pre-2001, there was almost always a big simply waiting in the painted area where he could make it difficult for penetrating players to score. Because of this, players in the 90s were frequently receiving contact when getting close to the basket. But with that being said, even that era could be considered soft when compared to the more barbaric decades before it. So let's go a little further back in time. The year is 1990, and the NBA is coming off of a decade of the bad boy Detroit Pistons mauling opposing teams on a nightly basis. For example, the Pistons famously had the quote Jordan rules, which were essentially specific tactics about how they would defend Michael Jordan. One of those tactics was that whenever he got in the air, they would put him on his butt. These methods were extremely dangerous and could certainly result in injuries for some of the premier players in the league. Strategically, from a defensive standpoint, it made sense why there were so many hard fouls in the 1980s. Because if a hard foul is the same penalty as a soft foul, then you might as well make the most of it as the defender and make them think twice about attacking the basket next time. That's when the league decided to change things in 1990 and made a flagrant foul a 2-shot penalty and possession of the basketball and a potential disqualification. This drastic change to the league's officiating made the game significantly less punishing basically overnight. But even the bad boy Pistons look soft when they're compared to the more grueling eras before them. Let's go further back in time. The year is 1980, and the NBA is coming off of a decade where fights and substance abuse were rampant throughout the league. The physicality was also quite intense throughout the 1970s, which caused the league office to evaluate their product and adjust the rules in an attempt to clean up their image. So in the year 1980, they decided to create the original flagrant foul rule. This was not the same as the stricter rule in 1990, but this rule simply defined it as a move that, quote, puts the safety or health of the opposing player at risk. When this flagrant foul was first introduced, it was not 2 free throws and possession of the basketball, but instead it was basically treated as a common foul, with the only additional penalty being that the opposing coach got to choose who shot the 2 free throws. Prior to this rule being established, there was basically no additional penalties for unnecessary roughness while fouling a player, which obviously meant much of the 70s and 60s were like the Wild West, as there wasn't much that you were not allowed to do. But even with this being said, this era would still be considered soft compared to the more savage eras that came before it. So let's go even further back in time. The year is 1936, which was more than a decade before the NBA was created. But with that being said, developing basketball leagues were still very prominent in the United States. One of the major developments was the offensive 3-second rule in 1936, which stated that a player couldn't be standing in the offensive key for at least 3 seconds. Without a flagrant foul rule of any sort, and without a penalty for camping under either basket, battling for rebounds was like a chaotic frenzy. Under the rim was basically a crowded war zone on any given night, as players battled for extra opportunities with few interruptions from the referees. Believe it or not, even this wasn't the most brutal era of basketball. To see that, we have to go even further back in time, towards the earliest days of the sport. The year is 1891, and Dr. James Naismith, a 31-year-old Canadian man, had just recently invented the game of basketball in Springfield, Massachusetts. When Naismith introduced the game to the world, some of the most popular sports in the area were rugby and American football. So obviously, operating from their familiar experience, people played the game of basketball as if it was rugby and American football. If you consider yourself a lover of tough physical defense to the point that it makes games extremely low scoring, well then this was the era for you. The very first basketball game ever held was in a YMCA training center between 18 male students, most of whom were in their early 20s. The hoop was made out of a peach basket that was nailed to some railing around 10 feet high into the air. Naismith was officiating the game, and he divided the teams into 9 players each. The game lasted for a total of 30 minutes, and it had an epic final score of 1-0. Months passed, but the early days of the game continued to have a raucous atmosphere, as players were grappling, pulling, pushing, tackling, and slamming into one another. This brutal and chaotic style created an exciting atmosphere for new basketball fans, and those fans began feeding off of that energy and became extremely rowdy as a result. In those early days of organized basketball, spectators and fans would often storm the courts and interfere with play due to the sheer excitement. So as a way to keep the fans from interfering with the leagues, they constructed steel wire cages to go around the basketball courts. That's right, basketball games used to be played in cages as if they were witnessing a UFC fight. With that being said, players did not tone down the physicality once the cages were installed. Players would often slam and throw each other into the steel cage, and as a result, they would be finishing games with cuts and bruises all over their bodies. One of those early players said that the courts were often covered in blood, and would even have stains all over from previous games. By far, this was the most barbaric and brutal era of basketball history, to the point that even the bad boy Pistons looked like soft pansies by comparison. Players in those days were often referred to as cagers because of their punishing style of play in those cages. It stayed that way for several years, but in the early 1900s, basically everyone was tremendously relieved when they replaced the steel cages with rope mesh nets, which significantly reduced the amount of injuries during the action. When we look back at the rich history of the NBA, you'll see that there was almost always a dynasty present in each decade that helped define that era. There was a dynasty in the 1950s, the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. But I'm sure most of you caught the gap in that time frame. In the 1970s, there was not a single dynasty team. Every single year, there was a different championship winner from the year prior. But just why exactly was this the case? Why couldn't one team establish itself as the clear dominant team of that era? Today, I'll do my best to answer that as we travel roughly a half century into the past. Before we get into the 1970s, you have to understand the era that the NBA was transitioning out of from the 1960s. At the very end of that decade, Bill Russell had reached the end of his career and was then retiring in 1969 as an 11-time NBA champion. His Celtics had a stranglehold on the league during his playing days, as they won 11 championships in a span of 13 years, including a whopping 8 straight. With Russell now finally out of the league, many teams around the NBA saw this as an opportunity to break through and win that evasive NBA championship trophy. The Celtics would obviously take time to acclimate after the giant void that was left by Russell's retirement, but with a young remaining superstar in John Havlicek, it wouldn't take them terribly long to rebuild a title contender once again. For years, the Los Angeles Lakers were the biggest victims of the Celtics' reign over the league. But with a recently assembled super team led by Jerry West, Wilt Chamberlain, and Elgin Baylor, and with the greatest winner now out of the league, the Lakers saw the early 70s as their time to shine. but they were far from the only team retooling and reloading for the more attainable championship. Towards the end of the 60s, the New York Knicks acquired the star point guard Walt Frazier, who was blossoming into superstardom right as Russell was making his exit. With the emergence of Frazier, the Knicks now had a fierce superstar tandem of Willis Reed and Walt Frazier, making them perennial contenders for the East title. Then there was the Milwaukee Bucks, who in 1969 drafted simply the greatest college basketball player of all time, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was then known as Lou Alcindor. Just one season after they drafted their franchise center of the future, they acquired the 31-year-old Oscar Robertson, who quickly transformed the Bucks from a mediocre team to an absolute powerhouse. And beyond that, another team was emerging, and that was the Baltimore Bullets. With excellent draft selections in back-to-back seasons, they acquired future Hall of Famers Earl Monroe and Wes Unseld. So basically, after the retirement of Bill Russell, the league quickly turned into a gladiatorial bloodbath, with many serious championship contenders all emerging pretty much simultaneously. This translated to a very competitive start to the decade, with various different winners. In 1970, the New York Knicks defeated the Bullets, the Bucks, and the Lakers on their way to winning the NBA championship, as Reed and Frazier acquired their first rings of their careers. The next season, the Milwaukee Bucks dominated the postseason, going 12-2 through the playoffs, defeating the Lakers and Bullets to secure the championship, which was the first championship rings for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson. To this day, the 1971 Bucks are considered as one of the greatest teams in basketball history. Then it was the Lakers' turn, and in 1972, they found their dominant stride, as they won an NBA record 33 straight regular season games. They also ended that regular season with a 69-13 record, which at the time was the best the league had ever seen. In the playoffs, they defeated the last two champions, the Knicks and the Bucks, as the Lakers won their first championship since the 1950s. Now at this point, the Celtics had re-emerged as serious title contenders, thanks to their superstar tandem of John Havlicek and the recently drafted Dave Cowens, who was being groomed to be the center to carry the torch after Bill Russell. The Celtics went 68-14 throughout the 72-73 regular season. But this was the New York Knicks' year to return to the mountaintop, as they defeated the Bullets, the Celtics, and the Lakers to win the 1973 championship. Then in 1974, Havlicek and Cowens successfully returned the Celtics to the Promised Land, as they defeated the Knicks and the Bucks to secure their first championship since the departure of Bill Russell. Now with this much talent, and with this many teams being capable of being championship winners, you would think that one of them would go on to establish themselves as a dynasty. But that's when the league started to go through a significant transition once again. Wilt Chamberlain retired from the Lakers in 1973, Willis Reed retired from the Knicks in 1974, and Oscar Robertson retired from the Bucks in 1974, which would lead to them missing the playoffs the following season, regardless of the fact that Kareem was clearly the best player in the league. With all of these legendary veterans retiring, this opened up the league for younger and newer championship contenders. This led to Rick Barry and the Golden State Warriors winning the championship in 1975, regardless of the fact that they only won 48 games throughout the regular season. In 1976, the Celtics won the championship again, winning their second title in 3 years, appearing as if they were on the verge of becoming a dynasty. But the thing is, John Havlicek was now in his late 30s, and was on a steady decline as he quickly approached his retirement. Along with that, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had been traded from the Milwaukee Bucks, because he felt that the Midwest culture didn't fit his needs. The Lakers team that he was traded to was actually a pretty awful rebuilding squad, after the retirements of Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain. Because of this, Kareem was essentially removed from the championship picture for the foreseeable future, naturally stopping him from being the dynasty leader of the 70s. Later on, everything suddenly got more competitive for everyone in the league, because in August of 1976, the NBA merged together with the ABA League. Essentially, the NBA retained its name while acquiring 4 ABA organizations and the ABA's players across the league. The 4 teams were the New York Nets, the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers, and the San Antonio Spurs. A perfect example of the tougher competition was the fact that teams like the defending champion Boston Celtics were now getting eliminated from the 1977 playoffs by the Philadelphia 76ers, who were led by a player who was acquired from the ABA, Julius Erving. Although the 76ers did go on to lose in the finals in 7 games to the Portland Trail Blazers. The Blazers won the 1977 championship, led by their all-time great center, Bill Walton. But for obvious reasons, this Blazers team didn't go on to become a dynasty, as their franchise-leading Walton went on to have one of the most disastrous strings of career-altering injuries that have ever been seen in sports. With Walton's injuries taking the Blazers out of the picture in 1978, the Washington Bullets finally broke through and won the NBA championship, led by their veteran stars of Wes Unseld, Elvin Hayes, and Bobby Dandridge. The Bullets then tried to repeat in 1979, but they ran into a motivated Seattle Supersonics team for the second straight time in the NBA Finals. But this time, the Sonics were victorious, as they won their only championship in franchise history. And then, in the 1979 NBA Draft, the rivalry of the future took formation, as Magic Johnson and Larry Bird began their rookie seasons in 1979 with the Lakers and Celtics, ushering in the new era and the dynasty teams of the 1980s. So now that we've reviewed the decade on a season-by-season basis, how can we summarize the reasons for a lack of a dynasty? Well, in reality, it was the perfect storm of reasons. To begin the decade, the ultimate winner had retired, sending the dynasty team of the 60s into rebuild mode. The early 70s saw the emergence of many fierce championship contenders, making the prospect of a repeat champion a near impossible outcome. In the mid-70s, veteran superstars on the usual contending teams were retiring left and right, paving the way for new title contenders within the league. The merger in 1976 immediately improved the competition within the league and shook up the power rankings of the NBA as they knew it. Injuries and trades ruined the possibility of all-time great centers becoming dynasty leaders. After the retirements, the trades, the injuries, and the merger, well-balanced and competitive teams alternated championships until the arrival of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, thus reintroducing dynasties right as the 1980s began. Ultimately, it all makes sense, but with all of the intricate moving pieces creating the perfect storm for a decade of parody, it kind of reveals just why a dynasty-free era is so rare within the NBA. The flop. To many basketball fans, it's one of the most disgusting, vile, and disgraceful displays of unsportsmanlike conduct that we can witness on a frequent basis. Yet we can't deny its competitive advantage and how some have perfected it down to an art form. For those of you who don't know, a flop is basically defined as this. It's when a player makes an intentional fall or stagger after little to no physical contact by an opposing player in order to draw a foul call by an official against the opponent. By nature, it is extremely deceitful and requires plenty of dramatized acting in order to convince the official to blow the whistle. With that being said, some players are better actors than others, and some are incredibly crafty at finding creative ways to draw the foul. Some of these modern players are guys like Chris Paul, LeBron James, Marcus Smart, and of course James Harden, just to name a few. Just a quick history lesson, although flopping is more prevalent now than ever before, it's not a new phenomenon by any means. In fact, flopping in the game of basketball goes as far back as the 1960s, as former Boston Celtic and a 7-time NBA champion Frank Ramsey made it a regular part of his game. It was something he personally admitted to as he spoke about his flopping tendencies from an article in Sports Illustrated that was published in 1963. Not only was Ramsey referred to as the master of deception, but he talked about how he was often booed and heckled by the fans for his obvious acting. Given the fact that Ramsey wasn't really a superstar, and given the fact that he played basketball in the 1960s, unfortunately, there is very little footage available displaying his flopping tendencies. Although it would be nearly impossible to claim who was the first player to attempt the flop, I think it's fair to say that Ramsey was certainly one of the first floppers of NBA history. Like I said before, there wasn't a ton of flopping on a widespread level throughout the league during that era. The 70s and 80s were extremely physical decades of the NBA, and the general mentality of the players was much more focused on presenting a tougher image. Not every player shared that mindset though, as some players weren't shy about selling a bit of their integrity for the sake of a blown whistle. If you ask my personal opinion, and the opinion of many viewers who were old enough to witness this, the player who flopped more than any other, and frankly the player who made flopping famous among basketball fans, was none other than the Serbian Vlade Divac. Vlade had a 16-year career in the NBA from 1989 to 2005 and was actually inducted to the Basketball Hall of Fame. He averaged nearly 12 points and 8 rebounds over the course of his career and was selected to one All-Star team in 2001. Vlade was obviously a solid center and was actually the player who was traded to the Charlotte Hornets for a rookie Kobe Bryant in 1996. But back when he played, what Vlade was known for more than anything else was his dramatic flopping theatrics. He was so notorious for this that I believe he was the main person who gave European basketball players their stereotype of being soft athletes. It's a stereotype that isn't very prevalent in today's game, but back in the 90s, it was an extremely common perception. Given his massive size, Vlade's consistent flopping appeared even more absurd than most other players, considering how it shouldn't be that easy to topple him over. He may have not been the first player to flop in the NBA, but in my opinion, Vlade is the player who made flopping a famous and well-known maneuver to the basketball world. As time went on, flopping became only more relevant and widespread throughout the entire league, and now it's at a point where more players flop than those who don't. The league made a feeble attempt to diminish the amount of flopping in 2012 when it introduced the no flopping rule. The rule stated that any player who flops during the regular season would first be warned, followed by fines in increments of $5,000 for each successful flop during the season. Longtime basketball fans like myself rejoiced when this rule was initially introduced, as we assumed this would finally be the change that would eliminate this pathetic acting out of the league. Well, unfortunately, the rule has since been painfully under-enforced since its establishment. Between 2012 and the summer of 2023, there have been thousands of flops, yet there has only been a grand total of 31 fines handed out to the players during the regular season. Notorious floppers like LeBron James and Chris Paul have never been fined during the regular season, and arguably today's greatest modern flopper, James Harden, has been fined only once. Obviously, with the lack of significant and consistent consequences, flopping has remained a staple element within the league, which ultimately affects the popularity and even the integrity of the game. But now, there's more to this story, as the league office just recently added another chapter to this flopping saga. You see, prior to the beginning of this current 2023 to 2024 season, the league established a new flopping rule intended to be even harsher and more effective than the previous rule. The fine penalties were now decreased from $5,000 to just $2,000, which would increase incrementally. But it was a different kind of consequence that caught everyone's attention. From the summer of 2023 forward, a flop would now result in a non-unsportsmanlike technical foul, which would result in a free throw for the opposing team. This was a massive deal, because for the first time in NBA history, flopping violations would result in immediate points for the opposing team. This is the level of consequences that I was originally hoping for. But still, my optimism was held in check. Because at the end of the day, the refs still had to enforce the rule for this to mean anything. Well, we're now approaching mid-January, and we're several months into the NBA season, and I'm thrilled to report some excellent news. In the 2023 to 2024 season so far, there have been a grand total of 19 fines given to the players for flopping. On 3 separate occasions, multiple players were fined on the same day. It's pretty clear that stars are not getting special treatment either, since MVP candidates like Luka Doncic and Nikola Jokic are among the players who have been fined. And again, these are also technical fouls that are scoring points for the opposing teams. which is one of the biggest deterrents to flopping that I can possibly think of. So again, to recap, in the first 11 seasons of the original flopping rule, there was 31 fines. And now, in less than one half of this current season, there have been 19 fines / technical fouls. I gotta say, I would still like to see the frequency of this penalties increase, considering how I've seen a lot of flops this year that didn't get fined. But make no mistake, the league took a massive step forward this season. And give credit where credit is due. Shout out to Adam Silver and the league office for making a legitimate improvement to the NBA product this season. If you've been following my channel for a while, then you know I'm someone who's been enjoying the game of basketball basically throughout my entire life. As a guy who's now in his mid-30s, I've seen a lot. Some of the incredible things I've witnessed from various superstars are not the kinds of things that future generations can understand by simply looking at a stat sheet. Some things you just either had to see with your own eyes or you needed to have it described to you in detail. So all of this got me thinking. Since I plan on being a dad in the next few years, and since there's a decent likelihood that my kids will like the game of basketball as well, what are things I'm going to tell them about the basketball I witnessed before they were born? This will certainly make for a weirder yet more interesting video, in the sense that we're sharing some of the more personal side of our basketball fandom. So regardless of where you're at in life, whether you're in your youth, you're a parent, or a grandparent, let me know in the comments what are things you would tell the next generation of basketball fans. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, I'll tell my kids about my dad's favorite player, Magic Johnson. Although I'm not old enough to have witnessed Magic's prime as it was actually happening, I was able to watch a countless number of full games thanks to my dad recording basically everything he saw on VHS tapes. I will tell my kids that I never saw a point guard as mesmerizing as Magic Johnson. Sometimes, great facilitators are described as if they have eyes in the back of their head, but no player fits that term better than Magic, as he would make fast break, no-look passes that would have even his teammates confused. I just know Magic was beating it into his teammates' head every practice to keep their eyes alert and to keep their hands ready, because at any moment, a speeding bullet of a no-look pass could be coming in their direction when they least expect it. On top of that, Magic had the Showtime Lakers sprinting like they were track athletes, so his ability to make split-second decisions with extremely precise accuracy and execution was truly marvelous. I don't care what anyone says, we haven't seen a player like him since, and that's what I'll tell my kids. Next, I'll tell them about my favorite player, Kobe Bryant. I'll tell them that from a stats and accolades standpoint, it's hard to argue that Kobe was the greatest player of all time. But when I was watching him at his best, night in and night out, I had never seen a basketball player more impressive in my entire life. At least 4 or 5 times a game, Kobe would hit shots that would leave me awestruck. It didn't matter if he was off balance, if he was 40 feet away, if he was double teamed, or if he was falling out of bounds. Every single shot was within his range, and it got to the point that I expected every shot to go in, and was somewhat surprised when it didn't. Before or since, I've never seen anyone else who could regularly make bad shots look like good shots. Which leads me to my next story. I will tell them that the closest player to Kobe when it comes to difficult shot making was Steph Curry. He was like the Mamba in the sense that he can make shots decently often that would make my jaw hit the floor. It's just that his were a little different. I'll tell them that Steph changed the game by forcing defenses to cover the ball handler the instant he crossed half court. Again, Kobe had the greatest wow factor, but Steph was the closest behind him. Now for the next story that I'll tell my kids, I'll probably aggravate quite a few people who are watching this video. But I don't care. Get your own kids. I will tell them about the difference between Michael Jordan and Kevin Durant. To me, the biggest difference that separates them from a character and legacy standpoint is also an important analogy and lesson for how we approach life. Let's start with Michael Jordan. When this guy was drafted, he was obviously a very hyped prospect with loads of talent and potential. But the organization he was joining in Chicago was an absolute joke at the time he arrived. They had never won a championship, they had no history of being successful whatsoever, and frankly, their own city was hardly even interested in watching them play. MJ changed all of that through hard work and commitment by being one of the strongest competitors and one of the most driven individuals in the history of sports. He transformed that franchise from the laughingstock of the league to an absolute powerhouse. He built it from the ground up into an empire that would become the gold standard of basketball. And that, more than any other reason, is why he's still revered and so respected within the world of sports. Then you have Kevin Durant. In a way that was similar to Jordan, Durant was a highly desired prospect heading into the NBA draft. As a player who was around 7 feet tall and had the skills of an elite perimeter shooter, people saw that he had the potential to be one of the select few greatest players of all time. But unlike Jordan, Durant didn't stick around to build his organization into a champion from the ground up, but instead he took the path of least resistance and joined the team that had just beaten him, that had already won a championship, and that had the greatest regular season record in NBA history. He opted to go with a brand that had already established itself and that already belonged to another star. Because of this, even after he was able to win 2 championships with the team, he was never respected to the extent that he would have been if he built up a championship team somewhere else. Obviously, being successful anywhere is going to be more enjoyable than simply not being successful. Yet there's something special about being the one who leads your own destiny, who builds your own legacy, and who makes something better than the way you found it. Being successful is awesome, but it always means more to yourself and to other people when you are the main reason for your own success, rather than riding the wave of what someone else created. Additionally, if my kids ever asked me what was the best era of basketball that I ever witnessed, I will tell them the 2000s. I don't think this will be a popular choice with many of my viewers, because from a physicality and rivalry standpoint, the 80s and 90s are usually held on the highest pedestal. And then, with recency bias being a factor, and with the tremendous amount of talent all over the league the last decade, some of my viewers will see the 2010s or even this modern era as the best in basketball history. For me, the 2000s were the best of both worlds. You still had intense rivalries like the Lakers and Kings and like the Pacers and Pistons. You had incredible individual superstars and you had an array of three-point shooters. But it wasn't to the extent that the game appeared as a soft jump shooters league. To put it simply, it had balance. It was the perfect blend of the slowed down physical nature from previous eras, but was also a time where tremendous shooters could ultimately be the determining factor in who wins the championship. If I could simply hit a switch and have the league instantly return to the style and product that it was throughout the 2000s, I would do it in a heartbeat. Lastly, I will tell my children about the weirdness of the 2020 bubble. If I'm being completely honest, I don't completely love or hate what transpired during the 2020 playoffs. In one sense, it was pretty freaking awesome, because there were almost no distractions, no actual audience, and no overwhelming stadium noise. In a way, it was just extremely competitive basketball in its purest form. But on the other hand, it was kinda lame, because all of the playoff games were just in one specific location, which means that the home court advantage was irrelevant, which also means that all of the regular season qualifying games were pretty much a waste of time, since the 1 through 4 seeds didn't actually get home court advantage like they deserved. It was basically this weird blip in NBA history where I was grateful for its presence, but also skeptical about its legitimacy for a variety of reasons. Obviously, I'll have a lot more to tell my hypothetical basketball-loving children than just this, but these are just some of the things that immediately come to mind for me. Without question, the slam dunk is the most exciting play in basketball, but as much as fans love it in the modern game, its history is a bit more layered than some people realize. In 1936, a 6'7" Olympian player by the name of Joe Fortenberry accomplished what is believed to be the first dunk in professional basketball history. This occurred at Madison Square Garden, and at that time, writers and fans were amazed at what they saw. The New York Times described the move as if he had pitched the ball downwards into the hoop, much like a cafeteria customer dunking a roll in coffee. In the 1940s, a 7-foot player by the name of Bob Kurland loved the dunk so much that he made it a regular part of his game. As a dominating tower of a player, Bob went on to be an Olympian gold medalist. Unfortunately, at the time, people viewed dunking as a disrespectful gesture to opposing teams that was worthy of retaliation. According to the legendary Lakers center George Mikan, players would typically dunk in practice, but would do layups in the actual games as a sign of respect. Satch Sanders played for the Boston Celtics in the 1960s, and he said, in the old days, defenders would run under you when you were in the air, trying to take people out of games so that they couldn't play. It was an unwritten rule. For decades, dunking was viewed in a mostly negative light. In 1967, high school and college players were banned from slamming the ball through the hoop. It is believed that this rule on dunking was due to the seemingly unfair dominance of the 7-foot 2-inch Lew Alcindor, who would eventually be known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Due to this, the rule is commonly referred to as the Lew Alcindor rule. This ban continued to be in place from 1967 to 1976. In 1976, the American Basketball Association hosted the first ever professional slam dunk contest, which was held during the halftime of their All-Star game. The contest was won by the man known as Dr. J, Julius Erving, which was thanks mostly to his iconic dunk from the free throw line, which is a dunk that would eventually become even more famous with the additions by Michael Jordan. Thanks to this memorable evening in the ABA, the slam dunk didn't just become accepted again, but it essentially became cool overnight. In 1984, the NBA held its first official dunk contest, and one of the contestants was the 6'9" Orlando Woolridge of the Chicago Bulls. Although he's not usually remembered for it, Orlando achieved the first ever East Bay Slam in dunk contest history. It had a somewhat underwhelming response from the crowd, and earned a score of 48. In 1994, J.R. Ryder made the first East Bay dunk in the dunk contest since Orlando Woolridge did it 10 years earlier. Charles Barkley described it as possibly the greatest dunk that he's ever seen. In 1997, a rookie Kobe Bryant won the slam dunk contest with his own East Bay dunk. The thing is, that contest overall was poorly received, and is considered by many as the worst dunk contest in NBA history. Due to this, the dunk contest was put on hiatus, and in the 1998 All-Star Weekend, the contest was replaced by the WNBA/NBA 2-ball contest. The slam dunk contest wouldn't appear in the 1999 season either, due to the NBA lockout. In the year 2000, the NBA's dunk contest made its triumphant return, as Vince Carter put on a show and won the competition in convincing fashion. Later that summer, Vince Carter participated in the Summer Olympics as a member of Team USA. In a game against France, he famously achieved the quote dunk of death, where he jumped clear over the 7'2" Frederick Weiss to complete the slam. Thanks to Carter's incredible dunking display in the year 2000, he's now widely viewed as the greatest dunker in NBA history. As the years have gone on, our adoration and fascination with the dunk only seems to be growing. Earvin Magic Johnson, one of the greatest players in NBA history, and many people still believe he's the greatest point guard of all time. Magic obviously had a historic beginning to his career, but what I believe isn't talked about enough is the iconic farewell to his NBA career, which was a roller coaster of emotions for the basketball community, finishing off with a satisfying ending that I personally will never forget. In order to understand the impact of Magic's beautiful moment, we first have to understand his journey to get there. Let's go all the way back to early June of 1991. At this time, Magic Johnson is just 31 years old. He's the runner-up for the league MVP, and he was the MVP in the previous season. He's coming off of a regular season where he averaged nearly 20 points and 12.5 assists, and he's about to make his 9th NBA Finals appearance as a 5-time NBA champion. To summarize it all, Johnson had just entered his early 30s and appeared to be every bit as good as he ever was before. Even without the recently retired Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as a teammate, Johnson was still able to lead his Lakers to the NBA Finals yet again. He had already built a resume worthy of being called the greatest point guard ever, and he seemingly still had a second half of his career ahead of him. When the 1991 Finals began, Magic was going toe-to-toe with the prime Michael Jordan. And although Michael ended up being the Finals MVP, Magic displayed a remarkable effort of his own. Many people believe that the Lakers never really had a true opportunity in this series, since Magic's two best scoring options, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both dealt with injuries throughout and missed a significant amount of time. Even without his two best weapons in the elimination game, Magic still put up 16 points, 20 assists, and 11 rebounds. What he didn't realize, and what none of the audience had realized either, is that this would be his last NBA Finals game of his entire career. Because a few months later, on November 7th, 1991, Magic held one of the most shocking press conferences in the history of sports. It was at this moment that the world became aware that the face of the Showtime Lakers was now HIV positive. At the time, little was known about the disease, so the assumption from almost everyone was that in a matter of months, he would lose a tremendous amount of weight and then pass away. Along with the horrific news of Magic's health, he also made it aware to the world that he was retiring from the Lakers, effective immediately. Imagine your favorite basketball player being at the peak of his abilities, and in a matter of seconds, he goes from one of the best players in the game to a retired player who could pass at any moment. Needless to say, this was a jarring pill to swallow for basketball fans, as seemingly everyone had their hearts broken for Magic on that day. Over the next several months and years, people would begin to learn a lot about living with HIV and the various details, like how it's transmitted and who's at risk. But many were still scared about the idea of being in contact with someone who had it. Then, in February of 1992, things got really interesting for Johnson and the basketball world. The NBA All-Star Game is an exhibition event where the fans vote and determine who will play for each conference. Despite the fact that Magic had retired from basketball, the fans still voted him in to be the starting point guard of the Western All-Stars. After receiving approval from doctors and from the league for Magic to play, the hype train was officially underway. The thing is, not everyone was so enthusiastic. Many players were concerned about their own well-being. Even Magic's former teammates, like Byron Scott and AC Green, said that he shouldn't participate. The player who was the most vocal about his displeasure with Magic competing was the Western Conference All-Star Karl Malone, who had this to say before the game was played.
If I get in a collision with a guy, it don't have to be Magic. It can be Joe Smoke. But the fact of the matter is, if you got the AIDS virus, it'll be hard for me to play as hard as I'm capable of playing.
Although there was plenty of drama heading into that night, there was also plenty of teammates and competitors who encouraged Magic to participate. Just as a spectator, you could tell that there was this awkward, unspoken tension in the air. But you could also sense the excitement and the magnitude of the moment, as the Orlando crowd gave Johnson a standing ovation during player introductions. Everyone understood that the ideal outcome was the West winning and Magic securing the All-Star Game MVP. But regardless of how badly the crowd wanted that, he still had to go out there and perform well. Seeing that Magic hadn't played a game in nearly a year, and seeing how he was now dealing with a life-altering disease, many people were concerned that he wouldn't have the conditioning or stamina to hang with the best players in the world. But all of those concerns were quickly put to rest soon after tip-off commenced. Although he built a legacy for himself as mainly a distributor, Magic was looking to score early on, and he did so with tremendous efficiency. Throughout the night, the West played with more energy and effort. and a 10-point lead quickly became a 20-point lead, and then a 20-point lead suddenly became a 30-point lead. The outcome was never really in question, but the MVP of the game appeared to be up for grabs, and the Western Conference's Clyde Drexler appeared to be the favorite heading into the second half with a monstrous stat line. After looking to score for a while, Magic finally got his first assist of the game with just under 9 minutes left in the third quarter, and then he got on a roll with his flashy Showtime passes that we were accustomed to. With less than 3 minutes left in the game, Magic suddenly hit the switch and displayed one of the most beautiful finishes in All-Star Game history. Just so you can sense the gravity and energy of this inspiring moment, I'll let you guys watch the final sequences of this game with no voiceover, and please pay attention to how Magic was at the center of it all.
135-106 with 2:46 to go, no doubt about this one.
There it is, there's the three.
Magic got his three.
Waiting for that moment to shoot the three.
Who has all the NBA three-point marks, most attempts, most made. Johnson, 2 in a row for Magic. He's going for the MVP. The Atlanta Hawk has 8. Chris Mullen for 3. It's out shooting the East in every quarter. And will be around the 60% mark, and another great pass. And Marley has his first points. Magic raises his. Well, this is a mismatch, and Magic would be the first to admit it. Michael Kind.
And that's 2, Magic said. Bring the next one on.
6, 5, three-pointer. Yes! Oh, my! Ladies and gentlemen, you just can't orchestrate it better than that.
When Magic hit that final falling away three-pointer, there was still 15 seconds left on the clock. Yet no one on the court seemed to even care, as they all surrounded and congratulated the Lakers legend. The game ended on the spot. It was a perfectly fitting and poetic way for the game to end, with a Magic Johnson jumper. Any question of who was the game's MVP now had an obvious answer, as Magic finished the game with 25 points, 9 assists, 5 rebounds, and 2 steals on 75% shooting. What started as a somewhat dramatic and awkward event ended up as one of the most uniting and inspiring conclusions in the history of sports. At the time, everyone believed that this was the last NBA game that he would ever participate in, and up until Kobe's farewell game in 2016, this exhibition contest stood alone as the most incredible farewell game by a Los Angeles Laker. Amazingly, over 3 decades later, Magic is still going, with the same smile and with the same enthusiasm that he was famous for. He's known as the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. For many years, he was the NBA's all-time leading scorer, and before Michael Jordan won his 6 championships, most people considered Kareem as the greatest player in basketball history. To this day, some still do. Heading into the 1988-89 NBA season, Kareem was 41 years old. He was a 6-time league MVP, a 6-time NBA champion, and a 2-time finals MVP. Alongside of Magic Johnson and James Worthy, Kareem and the Lakers were looking for their 3rd straight title. It was an extra emotional time in Los Angeles though, because Kareem had announced that this would be his last season in the NBA long before the regular season had concluded. With this in mind, the Lakers were motivated to win the championship yet again for their star center, sending him out on a high note and delivering a storybook ending. But now we fast forward in time. In June of 1989, the NBA Finals were about to take place between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Detroit Pistons. At first glance, it seemed like a colossal battle between 2 dynastic teams, but to understand the shocking results of this series, context is needed. The Detroit Pistons were a strong team who had finished the regular season with a 63-19 record. The team was rich in talent with veterans like Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, Mark Aguirre, Dennis Rodman, and Vinnie Johnson. They had an all-time great defense and one of the deepest rosters the NBA had ever seen. All of this team was incredibly talented and appeared on paper as if they were championship ready, but the Pistons were yet to prove it in the postseason, and many were skeptical about their abilities to dethrone the defending champions. Just 1 year earlier, the same two teams met in the 1988 NBA Finals, and after a long, hard-fought 7-game series, the Lakers had come out on top, like they had many times throughout the 1980s. The Los Angeles Lakers were heading into the '89 Finals as the defending back-to-back NBA champions, who were seeking the NBA's first three-peat since the 1960s. All of the momentum was clearly on the Lakers' side. The 1987 and 1988 Los Angeles Lakers are still recognized even to this day among the greatest teams in NBA history. The Lakers had begun the decade with a championship and were looking to finish off the decade with their third straight championship and sixth championship in the 80s. They seemed poised to do it too. Magic Johnson was arguably the NBA's best player at the time and led the Lakers to have the best offense in the NBA that season, while securing the League MVP award. He was accompanied by his usual Hall of Fame supporting cast, like James Worthy, who was in the prime of his career and was coming off of last year's Finals MVP award. And of course, he also had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, that would be retiring at the end of the season. So the still productive captain of the Los Angeles Lakers was anticipating a fairy tale ending for his career, securing a legendary 7th NBA championship ring as he rode off into the sunset. The story of the season appeared to be indicating that destiny was in fact on the Lakers' side. Not only was the narrative supporting the Lakers, but so was the eye test. The Lakers were an absolute juggernaut throughout the 1989 Western Conference playoffs. The Lakers began the first round of the playoffs by sweeping the talented Portland Trailblazers 3-0. The second round, they swept an even better Sonics team 4-0. And then they destroyed the powerful 55-win Phoenix Suns in the conference finals 4-0. The Lakers were undefeated throughout the Western Conference playoffs. They were heading into the NBA Finals against the Detroit Pistons, looking to make history and become the only team ever to go undefeated in the NBA playoffs. As a quick recap, the Lakers were going for their third straight title against the team they had just beat the previous year, looking for the exclamation point of a sixth championship in a decade that they had already claimed as their own, led by the league MVP on the final year of arguably the greatest player of all time, with a chance to declare themselves as the greatest team of all time by finishing out an undefeated postseason run, which had never been done before in the history of the NBA. Both of these finals teams were incredibly talented and championship worthy, so a sweep wasn't necessarily expected, but it was presumed that if a sweep was going to happen, it was going to be the Lakers who were doing the sweeping. But as we like to say in the sports world, that's why they play the game. As a footnote, the Los Angeles Lakers shooting guard Byron Scott would be missing the series for his team after popping his hamstring in practice the day before the finals began. With that being said, Michael Cooper was replacing him in the starting lineup. Cooper was a former Defensive Player of the Year and a quality three-point shooter in the NBA during his era, so the Lakers still appeared to be in great shape. When the games began, the Pistons got off to a hot start and never relinquished it. The absence of Byron Scott was beginning to be felt in this series. With Scott unavailable, the Lakers' rotation suffered, and defending all of the Detroit Pistons' perimeter scoring guards became even more difficult. The Pistons took the first game 109-97, leaving the Lakers' hopes of an undefeated postseason run in shambles. The Lakers were poised to bounce back in Game 2. Despite Joe Dumars taking advantage of the Lakers being short-handed on guards and dropping 24 points in the first half alone, the Lakers still managed to have a 62-56 lead at halftime. If the Lakers could hold on, they would be tying the series at a game apiece, while taking home court advantage with the series heading back to Los Angeles. But that's when disaster struck. With only several minutes left in the third quarter, the Lakers were up by a bucket, and Detroit was on a fast break when Magic Johnson started hobbling. He had pulled his hamstring, and the pain was clearly seen on his face. Magic wanted to push through it, but eventually he had no choice but to sit out the rest of the game. With their MVP gone, the Lakers fought valiantly but ultimately came up short, falling to the Pistons 108-105. With Game 3 being played back in Los Angeles, the Lakers found themselves in a must-win situation. With the season on the line, Magic Johnson started Game 3, but he wouldn't last very long. After just 5 minutes of play, Magic left the game with severe pain in his hamstring. The still talented Lakers stepped up to the challenge and tried to win at home without their best player. But despite James Worthy's 26 points and Kareem's vintage effort of 24 points and 13 rebounds, the Pistons' healthy talent still prevailed in a close one, 114-110. At this point, the writing was on the wall for the Lakers. Magic Johnson didn't even try to play in the 4th game of the NBA Finals. James Worthy was one superstar who wasn't going out without a fight, and dropped an efficient 40 points in Game 4. Despite the Lakers' good start to the game, the Pistons' overall healthy talent eventually wore them down, winning the 4th and final game of the series, completing what is now known as one of the most stunning sweeps in NBA history. Kareem closed out his final game at the age of 42, while his iconic co-star was forced to watch from the sidelines. In that last performance, Kareem finished with just 7 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists on 2 of 8 shooting. Ultimately, it's not the worst way for a legend to end his career, but considering how things deteriorated in the NBA Finals and how the Lakers won the championship just a year prior, Kareem went down as another example of a player calling it quits just a little later than what would have been ideal. The NBA playoffs are about to begin, and needless to say, this is the most significant and crucial time of the basketball season. Simply put, NBA legacies are defined by what you accomplish on the game's biggest stage. Numerous players have had strong, established reputations heading into the postseason, just for him to then completely redefine the way he's perceived thanks to his performance in the playoffs. Within the span of the next couple months, some of these modern superstars will not be perceived as we currently see them today. Whether it's fair or not, this is the stage that defines the greats and the not-so-greats. Today, I have a list of NBA legends who were perceived a certain way and then completely shifted the way they were viewed, with just one great postseason run. First off, Dirk Nowitzki in 2011. Up until this legendary championship by the Dallas Mavericks, Dirk was basically completely defined by his postseason failures. For a while, people were referring to him and the Mavericks as Dirk Nowitzki and the Alice Mavericks, due to the lack of D in their game. Even his lone MVP was marred by disappointment, as his first-seeded 67-win Mavericks were eliminated in the first round of the 07 playoffs by the 8th-seeded Warriors. It was arguably the greatest first-round upset in playoff history. Just the year prior, Dirk and the Mavs were up 2-0 in the NBA Finals over the Miami Heat, just to then choke it away by losing the next 4 games straight. Although those 2 instances are massive examples of Dirk being a disappointment, it was far from the only times. In the last 11 seasons before the 2011 postseason, the Mavericks had won at least 50 games, and 3 of those were 60-win seasons, yet throughout that time, they failed to win a single championship. The narrative was firmly established that Nowitzki was a choker, and although the Mavericks always won plenty of games, pretty much everyone recognized them as fool's gold. Then, in one postseason run, everything changed for Nowitzki. He and the rest of the Mavericks defeated the highly favored Big Three Miami Heat in the NBA Finals in 6 games. Seemingly everyone had forgotten his struggles leading up to that moment, as everyone was focusing on LeBron's failures that finals. Dirk established himself as an NBA champion and as an undisputed NBA legend overnight, and since then, hardly anyone ever brings up his struggles prior to that postseason. Jerry West in 1972. West is remembered as one of the greatest players in NBA history, and even earned the nickname Mr. Clutch. But for a time, winning and clutch performances were not a thing that was defining his legacy. For a while, it was the fact that he had never won an NBA championship. Between 1962 and 1970, West made it to the NBA Finals a whopping 7 times. Yet tragically, his Lakers were eliminated all 7 times straight. It was something that haunted him and kept him from sleeping at night. He had firmly established the narrative that he was the greatest loser to ever play basketball. That was until his title run in 1972. Although West was never able to get past the Celtics, they didn't have to in the 71-72 season. It wasn't even his best postseason run, and he wasn't even named the Finals MVP after they defeated the Knicks. But it didn't matter. West was now an NBA champion, and can then be known as Mr. Clutch regardless of the fact that he had just recently lost 7 straight finals. LeBron James in 2016. Before LeBron had led his Cavs to beat the 73-9 Golden State Warriors, his legacy wasn't nearly what it is today. At the time, he had only won 2 championship rings, which many people believe he won by taking the easy road with a super team in Miami. Up to this point, people believed that all of his rings were attained by riding high as the massive favorite. Furthermore, his historically awful performances in the 2011 finals were still very present in people's minds. But as disappointing as that series was, it wasn't enough to overshadow what he did in 2016. He led his Cavs to come back from a 3-1 deficit to beat the juggernaut Warriors, as James led every player over the course of the series in points, assists, rebounds, blocks, and steals. Overnight, he went from a known frontrunner to the man who achieved the greatest upset in professional basketball history. Michael Jordan in 1991. Leading up to the 1991 playoffs, MJ was probably seen as the best player in the game. Yet regardless of that fact, many people believed that he had a fatal flaw in his game that would keep him from winning an NBA championship. He was just too selfish. Up to that point, the narrative was that scoring leaders don't win championships, but team leaders do. And can you blame them? In the 60s, Wilt did all the scoring, but Bill won the championships. In the 80s, neither Bird or Magic won a single scoring title, but they won almost all of the rings in that era. This wasn't just a perception of the time, but a historical fact, considering how since the NBA merger, not a single scoring champion had won the NBA championship. MJ was on a streak of 5 scoring titles, so his individual talent wasn't in question, but his legacy was. Fittingly, Jordan was matched up against Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals, who many people viewed as the ultimate team player and leader. Obviously, you know how this played out. Jordan and the Bulls won the championship in 5 games, and he did it while leading all players in scoring. Not only did people immediately start to view Michael Jordan differently, but he destroyed the entire belief system that a scoring champion can also be an NBA champion. Simply put, he broke the mold. These are just some of the players who had their legacies change seemingly overnight based on their performances in the playoffs. Makes you wonder which NBA stars will be changing their legacies and reputation in these current NBA playoffs. Guess we'll just have to wait and find out. When we take a moment to look back at the greats of the game, we notice several pillars of the sport who were able to achieve things that seem almost impossible by today's standards, like Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game, his 50 points per game average, and even his mind-blowing quintuple-double. But one area that stands out specifically was the way these giants of the game were able to dominate the boards to an extent that is difficult to comprehend. Wilt Chamberlain once had a streak of 12 seasons where he averaged at least 20 rebounds per game, while Bill Russell had a streak of 10 seasons with at least 20 rebounds per game. Since the late 1960s, no one else has averaged 20 rebounds per game. Not Dennis Rodman, not Moses Malone, not Andre Drummond or Dwight Howard. Absolutely no one. Wilt once got 55 rebounds in a single game, and no one in the last 50 years plus has ever got as many as 40 rebounds. Russell once got 40 rebounds in a deciding 7th game of the NBA Finals. The NBA record for the most rebounds in a single season is by Chamberlain in 1961, when he pulled down a total of 2,149 rebounds. He also owns the 2nd spot, the 3rd, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th spot on that list. Between Russell and Chamberlain combined, they own 19 of the top 20 spots on the NBA's all-time rebounds list. I think you guys get the point. Chamberlain and Russell dominated the boards to an extent that made them seem like demigods, and comparing other great rebounders of the game to them seems laughable to even suggest. But just why exactly were these two legendary rebounders so broken? Was it all about their skills and talent alone? Or was there other key contributing factors that elevated them to astronomical heights? Today, I'll do my best to answer that as we analyze the players, the eras, and the rules that could have played a factor in this scenario. First off, let's take a look at the attributes of the two players who had a stranglehold on rebounding, Chamberlain and Russell. Not only were these two players massive, Chamberlain standing at 7 foot 1 inches tall and Russell at 6'10", but they were both insanely athletic, even by modern big man standards. Both Chamberlain and Russell competed as track and field athletes in college. Not only did they compete, but they were both elite in this area, especially when it comes to the high jump competition. At the University of Kansas, Wilt won the Big 8 championship a total of 3 times, reaching upwards of 50 inches on the high jump. As incredible as his leaping ability was, Russell's may have been even more impressive, as in 1956, Russell was ranked as the 2nd highest leaper in the United States, and as the 7th highest leaper in the entire world. During the West Coast relays, Russell even went as far as tying the famous Olympian Charlie Dumas. Dumas later went on to win the gold medal and be crowned as the greatest leaper in the entire world. So now that we've established their size and athleticism, let's delve into some of the perceptions of their NBA competition. Many modern basketball fans often criticize the competition of that era, claiming that players like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain took advantage of the undersized competition. Let me put this as frankly as I can. This is completely and utterly false. It's a common misconception based on low information fans who perpetuate this narrative, mostly due to their lack of research. The average height of an NBA player in 2022 is 6 foot 6 inches tall. The average height of the NBA player in 1962 is 6 foot 5 inches tall. But you also have to consider that most players were measured with their shoes off back in the 60s. So if there is in fact a difference, it's extremely insignificant. But that's just the average player. How about we look more specifically at the center position? I spent way too much time crunching these numbers myself, and the average height of the NBA center in 2022 is 6 foot 10 inches tall. And 60 years ago, in 1962, it was also 6 foot 10 inches tall. Simply put, if Russell and Chamberlain dominated the game for reasons related to their era, it definitely had nothing to do with the size of their competition. So now that we've considered their size, athleticism, and competition, it's probably safe to say that they would put up some of these rebounding numbers if they played in the modern game, right? Nope, not exactly, because there's still several other factors. For one, Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain took less breaks throughout their career. These two players sit in the top 2 spots for the highest minutes per game average in NBA history. Wilt with a career average of 45.8 minutes and Bill at 42.3 minutes. To put that in perspective, the current 2022 leader in minutes per game is Fred VanVleet, and he's only playing 38.6 minutes a night. When Wilt averaged 25.7 rebounds in 1962, he played every single minute he possibly could have, as he averaged 48.5 minutes per game that season. Obviously, more time on the court is going to boost your numbers all around, but it's also worth appreciating the amount of stamina and dedication that it takes to be on the floor for that long, especially on a night-to-night basis. If everyone could do it while remaining healthy and effective, then every great player would. Russell and Chamberlain are just the 2 guys who could actually pull that off. Although Chamberlain and Russell were clearly the most dominant rebounders of their era, they simply weren't the only players putting up goofy rebounding numbers compared to today's standards. Almost every big man in the 60s was. Of the highest rebound seasons in NBA history, the top 25 spots are all owned by players who played in the 1960s. That's not a coincidence, that's a trend. Many 90s basketball fans would say that Dennis Rodman is the greatest rebounder they've ever seen, and at his very best, Rodman averaged 18.7 rebounds per game in 1992. In the 1962 season alone, 4 players averaged more rebounds per game than Dennis Rodman did at his very best. The general rebounding numbers were significantly higher for centers in the 1960s, and there's several reasons for this. For one, the three-point line did not exist yet. Some of you hoopers have heard your coach say this term, long shots equals long rebounds. Due to the basketball hitting the iron harder when it's a shot from a greater distance, more rebounds are being acquired at the perimeter, which is a big reason why you're seeing many guards average much more rebounds than the position usually averaged in years past. Russell and Chamberlain basically never had to deal with these perimeter rebounds, since the three-point line did not exist in the years they played. With a lack of the three-point line, more shots were taken close to the basket, which meant more rebounds were easily within their reach. This isn't just pertaining to Russell and Wilt, but it naturally boosted the rebounding totals of the center position as a whole. Second is the fact that the pace of play was much faster in the 1960s, which means more possessions, which equals more shot attempts, which also means more opportunities to get rebounds. Just how impactful was that pace of play? Well, consider this stat. In this current 2022 season, teams are averaging 88 shot attempts per game, and in 1962, teams were averaging 107.7 shot attempts per game. That's for each team in the game, which means that each basketball game in the 1960s had nearly 40 more shots taken each night compared to what modern fans are used to. If roughly half of those shots are missed, then that's around 20 more rebounds that were up for grabs each night. But that's also if we assume that field goal percentages are about the same in the 60s, and they definitely were not. The third reason why rebounding was higher in the 60s was the fact that the league was, by and large, not as efficient shooting the basketball, as the jump shot was still early in its evolution. Today, teams are shooting about 46% from the field. In the 80s, they shot generally around 48% from the field, and in the 60s, it got as low as 41% from the field. Faster play, more shots, and less makes is a recipe for a massive rebounding advantage for 60s players. In this modern year in the NBA, teams are averaging about 44.8 rebounds a game. 60 years ago, they were averaging 71.4. That's basically the equivalent of making 2-point shots worth 3 points and making 3-point shots worth 4 points, and then acting surprised when more players are having 40-point games. So in conclusion, if someone asks you if Chamberlain and Russell were able to get all of those rebounds because of how good they were, or if it was because of the era they played in, the appropriate answer is simply yes.
Throughout the decades, there have been many disappointing NBA franchises. Several organizations have a reputation of consistent losing. But in order to take the title of the most cursed franchise in NBA history, a team has to have more than just consistent failure. It needs to have the expectations and potential set to astronomically high levels just to end up falling tremendously short. One specific organization fits that description to a T: the Portland Trail Blazers. Yes, Portland has one lone championship banner hanging up in the rafters, but that title goes all the way back to the year 1977, and considering the opportunities they've had, this is a franchise that should have many Larry O'Brien trophies, not just one. In order to understand just how far the franchise fell from its potential, we have to take it all the way back to the team's inception. The Portland Trail Blazers started as an NBA expansion team in the 1970-71 season. Like most expansion teams, the Blazers struggled out of the gates, as they missed the playoffs in their first 6 seasons of existence. Fortunately, they had one of the all-time great centers by the name of Bill Walton. With Walton at the helm, the Blazers achieved the unexpected and won the NBA championship in the 1977 season. The Blazers started the following season looking as if they were ready to repeat, and through the first 60 games, they had a 50-10 record. At this point, many people in basketball circles were predicting this team to be an NBA dynasty. Unfortunately, this is where everything began to go downhill. Walton suffered a broken left ankle that caused him to miss the remainder of the season. This certainly wasn't anything out of the ordinary for Walton, as the guy has an injury history long enough to make even Anthony Davis blush. The thing is, Walton suffered so many reoccurring injuries that he began blaming the Blazers medical team and demanded that the organization trade him. Having recently won the championship, Portland's management was hesitant to trade their superstar big man, so in a protest, Walton sat out the entirety of the 78-79 season. By that point, Walton was now a free agent and signed with the San Diego Clippers. If there was anyone who put a curse on the Portland franchise, it was probably Bill Walton on his way out the door, as the Blazers have struggled to replicate their success ever since. After many years of missing the playoffs or early postseason exits, the Blazers found themselves in the 1984 draft with the second overall pick. The incredible Hakeem Olajuwon had just been taken with the first pick by the Houston Rockets. Now remaining on the board was the hyped 7'1" prospect out of Kentucky, Sam Bowie, and then some shooting guard named Michael Jordan. With Portland on the clock, management considered the fact that they already had a young phenom by the name of Clyde Drexler at the shooting guard position. So instead of taking Jordan, they decided to select the big man Bowie in order to fill their lacking center position. This is yet another great example of why you should draft players based on their talent and not by your position needs. Bowie went on to be a bust as he not only struggled with injuries, but he also failed to live up to the production levels that scouts expected. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan simply went on to be the consensus greatest player of all time. This was a mistake that still haunts Portland to this very day, but unfortunately, this wasn't the last time that they would make this kind of mistake. More on that in a bit. With an extremely talented roster, led by all-stars like Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter, the Blazers made it to the NBA Finals twice, in 1990 and in 1992. Unfortunately, they ran into two juggernauts. They were defeated by Isaiah Thomas and the Detroit Pistons in 1990, and then defeated by Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls in 1992. From this point on, the Blazers would consistently make the playoffs, but were never really considered again as true title contenders until around the year 2000. Led by players like Scottie Pippen, Rasheed Wallace, Arvydas Sabonis, and Damon Stoudemire, the 99-2000 Blazers won 59 regular season games and had a strong advantage late into the postseason. In Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals against the Los Angeles Lakers, Portland had a 13-point lead at the end of the third quarter, and momentum was clearly on their side. In the fourth quarter, things took a dramatic turn for the worse. Many people think the refereeing in this game was questionable, or even rigged, as the NBA may have had an agenda to get the Lakers to the finals. That may or may not have been the case. But what was even more questionable than the refs' motives was the Blazers' ability to handle the pressure, as they went completely scoreless for an 8-minute stretch in that fourth quarter, including 13 straight missed field goal attempts. Needless to say, the Blazers choked away the game as the Lakers went on to win the NBA championship. Despite having a deep and talented roster worthy of a championship, the early 2000s Blazers just couldn't stop stumbling over their own feet, as the team was deeply affected by their off-the-court issues, which earned them the nickname the Jailblazers. Along with that, they lacked maturity late in games, as players like Rasheed Wallace were consistently receiving technical fouls at a record rate. Based on their depth and their talent, this squad should have won a title. But instead, by the mid-2000s, the franchise was completely in rebuild mode. They appeared as if they were finally ready to turn their misfortunes around, as they had the first overall pick of the 2007 NBA Draft. History would repeat itself though, as Portland once again had their eyes set on a 7-foot big man, this time a player by the name of Greg Oden. They took Oden with the first pick, and the player they passed up to do so was the incredible scoring assassin Kevin Durant. Due to his various injuries, Oden would only play 105 regular season games in his very short basketball career, and he had completely retired from the NBA by only the age of 26. Meanwhile, Kevin Durant would go on to be a 2-time NBA champion, a 2-time Finals MVP, an MVP, and is now widely recognized as one of the greatest players of all time. It was just like Sam Bowie and Michael Jordan all over again. Even though they botched yet another golden opportunity in the draft, it didn't yet appear as if all hope was lost, as the Blazers still had one of the most lethal weapons in the league, the young shooting guard Brandon Roy. At his peak, Kobe Bryant referred to Roy as the toughest player to guard in the entire Western Conference. But just like every other bright spot in Blazers history, this one didn't last very long either. After making 3 straight All-Star teams, Roy's knees had deteriorated to such an extreme extent that he no longer had any cartilage between the bones. By the time he was 26 years old, he had played his final game with the Portland Trail Blazers. Here's the thing. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the Blazers are the most cursed franchise in the league, not necessarily because of how bad they are, but because of how promising they appear to be time and time again, just to end up leaving their fan base incredibly disappointed. And here's a stat that perfectly sums that up. From 1983 to 2003, the Blazers went to the playoffs for an impressive 21 consecutive seasons, and yet never won a single championship during that stretch. That's the longest streak of playoff berths without a championship in NBA history. To put that in perspective, the Spurs had a streak of 22 seasons where they made the playoffs and they won 5 championships in that stretch. The Celtics had a streak of 19 seasons and won 11 championships, and the Lakers had a streak of 17 seasons and won 5 championships. That pretty much sums up the Portland Trail Blazers as an organization. Typically, they're not good enough to win championships, but they're also consistently average, which means they're rarely in the draft lottery, which almost completely ruins their chances to acquire franchise players. And even then, when they are in the draft lottery, the universe still finds a way to screw it up for them, just like it did in these instances. All in all, the Blazers should have numerous championship banners in the rafters. They should have the jerseys hung of 2 of the greatest players of all time, and they should have several more Hall of Famers in their history. But unfortunately, injuries repeatedly destroyed those careers. This man had nicknames like Goliath and the Record Book for a good reason. He regularly had all-around performances that resulted in video game stat lines. The only reason why they don't blow our minds when we hear them is because we've already heard them so many times. Now, concerning Wilt's greatest games, he has many, but some are so insane that they demand all the attention and overshadow the others as a result. Everyone knows about his 100 points in 1962, his incredible quintuple-double game, his 55 rebound game against Bill Russell, and even his 78 point and 43 rebound game against Elgin Baylor and the Lakers. The thing is, Wilt has some other incredible performances that if they were achieved by literally anyone else, they would be immortalized in basketball history. But because it was Wilt that did it, it was just seen as another night and has flown under the radar. Today, we're diving into some of those games as we appreciate the greatest games from Wilt that no one talks about. First off, January 13th, 1962, when Wilt Chamberlain's Philadelphia Warriors defeated Walt Bellamy and the Chicago Packers 135 to 117. Wilt played all 48 minutes and dropped a ridiculous 73 points and 36 rebounds on 60.4% shooting. Wilt clearly only had one thing on his mind this night, as he didn't record a single assist. January 25th, 1960, when Wilt Chamberlain's Philadelphia Warriors defeated the Detroit Pistons 127 to 117. This was Chamberlain's rookie season and he was still in his early 20s, but despite being the new kid on the block, he still dominated on a historic level, with 58 points, 42 rebounds, and 4 assists on 58.5% shooting. His 58 points is still the most points ever scored by a rookie in a single game, and his 42 rebounds is also the most by a rookie, with the exception of 3 other nights that eclipsed this total during that same rookie season. On February 9th, 1969, Wilt Chamberlain's Los Angeles Lakers defeated the Phoenix Suns as he poured in 66 points, 27 rebounds, and 4 assists. Incredibly, he made 29 out of his 35 shots, which is a field goal percentage of 82.9%. In terms of field goal percentage, this is still the most efficient scoring performance in NBA history by a player with at least 60 points. This remarkable performance came pretty late in his career, as it was not only his last 60-point game, but it was even his last 50-point game that he would ever have. On February 2nd, 1968, Wilt's 76ers defeated the Detroit Pistons 131 to 121, and he didn't just have a triple-double on this night, but he actually got 2 triple-doubles worth in the same game, as he put up 22 points, 25 rebounds, and 21 assists on 69.2% shooting. To this day, Wilt and Russell Westbrook are the only 2 players in league history to achieve the 20-20-20 triple-double. March 31st, 1967, Wilt's 76ers defeated Bill Russell and the Celtics in Game 1 of the Eastern Division Finals, 127 to 113. Bill Russell is commonly known for outshining Wilt Chamberlain in the postseason,
But this was certainly not the case in 1967, as Wilt dropped an unofficial quadruple-double of 24 points, 32 rebounds, 13 assists, and 12 block shots on 69.2% shooting. His 12 block shots were tracked by the respected Harvey Pollack, years before the league made blocks an official stat. If this quadruple-double was recognized as an official achievement, then it would still stand today as the only quadruple-double in NBA playoff history. And the fact that it came against arguably the greatest defender ever only makes it more impressive. On February 24, 1967, Wilt's 76ers defeated the Baltimore Bullets 149-118. On this night, Wilt had one of the greatest triple-doubles of all time, as he dropped 42 points, 30 rebounds, and 10 assists on 100% shooting. Yep, you heard me correctly. He didn't miss any of his 18 shot attempts, which is the most shots ever taken without a miss. It's unfortunate that we don't have his blocks numbers from this game. Otherwise, this stupid stat line would look even stupider. October 23, 1965, Wilt's 76ers defeated the Detroit Pistons 120-103. It was another insanely efficient night for Wilt, as he unofficially dropped 53 points, 21 rebounds, 2 assists, and 15 blocks on 84% shooting. The only unofficial part of Wilt's stat line is the block shots, which were once again tracked by Harvey Pollack. With the blocks, it's one of the greatest two-way performances of all time, and without him, it's still pretty darn incredible. February 25, 1962. In the only loss on the list, Wilt's Warriors were defeated by the New York Knicks 149-135. On this evening, Chamberlain put up 67 points, 21 rebounds, and 1 assist on 65.8% shooting. Now this game by itself is incredible, but what's most significant about this performance is that it was the beginning of an incredible streak. Other than Wilt Chamberlain, no player in NBA history has ever scored at least 60 points in back-to-back games. Starting with this game, Wilt did this in 4 straight games, and the 4th game was 100 points. Unfortunately, Wilt really disappointed everyone when the streak ended in the 5th game, where he had an off night and scored only 58 points. The craziest part about this list is that there's so many games that didn't make the cut, and I could easily do a part 2 and a part 3. And to think that some people have the audacity to say that this man isn't in the top 10. Obviously, there have been many incredible performances throughout the NBA's existence, but it's interesting to consider the games that were immortalized in basketball lore in comparison to the performances that were absolutely incredible, but for one reason or another are just not as remembered or revered as those other games. That's where this video comes in, as it isn't an all-encompassing video of the greatest games that aren't talked about, but the video just includes some of those greatest games. So if this video does well and the interest seems to be there, I'll definitely consider turning this one into a series. Now before we get into the list, there's one other important aspect to consider. History is written by the victors, and in terms of the game of basketball, this is why many of the greatest performances have gone by the wayside, since most of the players on this list had these dominant performances while playing on the losing side. Occasionally, there will be a game like Michael Jordan's 63 in Boston Garden that gets the recognition despite being in a losing effort, but more often than not, they just become overlooked and forgotten over time. So let's put a spotlight on them, shall we? First off, Magic Johnson in Game 5 of the 1991 NBA Finals. This was Magic's last professional basketball game before he announced his retirement due to the HIV virus. And although this final game is remembered for being the beginning of a dynasty, many have forgotten just how great Magic was, in what was unknowingly his farewell game. Many fail to mention this, but the Lakers were actually riddled with injuries in these NBA Finals. And in this championship-clinching game, Magic was without 2 of his best scoring teammates, James Worthy and Byron Scott. Despite being extremely short-handed, with his back against the wall in typical Magic Johnson fashion, he still made his teammates significantly better, and made the contest as competitive as it could have been. He finished the game with 16 points, a whopping 20 assists, and 11 rebounds. No other player in NBA Finals history has ever got as many assists as Magic did this game, and again, he did it without his best weapons and in his final game before his retirement. Regardless of the defeat, it's definitely one of the more underappreciated performances of all time. Second up is Draymond Green in Game 7 of the 2016 NBA Finals. For obvious reasons, this game is remembered as the climactic ending of the Cavaliers' 3-1 comeback, and LeBron James' blocked shot and Kyrie Irving's three-pointer get all of the fame and the attention. It was a close game that needed those clutch plays from the Cavs, but the only reason it was even close in the first place is because of one Warrior specifically, Draymond Green. It wasn't a great day in the Golden State, but Draymond had the game of his life and wasn't going out without a fight, as he finished with 32 points, 15 rebounds, and 9 assists on 73.3% shooting and 6 of 8 from three-point range. He led all players in points and rebounds, and he led all Warriors in assists. Not only did he score 32 of the Warriors' 89 points, but he did it on 73.3% shooting compared to the rest of his teammates who shot 30.8%. If just one other Warrior showed up and had a good game as well, Golden State probably wins that championship. Next is Vince Carter in Game 3 of the 2001 Eastern Conference Semifinals. Although the series ultimately resulted in a 7th game loss to Allen Iverson and the 76ers, it wasn't without Carter having arguably the greatest game of his career, as he dominated in a number of aspects. He was scorching from the perimeter as he dropped 50 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds, and 4 blocks on 65.5 shooting from the field. He was also 9 of 13 from three-point range, which is 3 times as many three-pointers made as the entire 76ers team. It's easy to simply remember Carter for his above-the-rim athleticism, but at his best, he was also an elite sniper from three-point range and one of the best all-around scorers that the game had to offer. Fourth up is David Thompson in his last regular season game of the 1978 season. On April 9, 1978, David Thompson had one of the most explosive yet efficient scoring performances of NBA history. The fact that the game isn't on film and the fact that the Nuggets lost the game are the two major reasons why this performance doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. Thompson was trailing George Gervin by only 14 points for the league scoring crown, so Thompson obviously wanted to have a great scoring night, and that's exactly what he did. To start the game, David made a ridiculous 20 out of his first 21 shots, which is insanely efficient, especially when you consider the fact that he was a perimeter shooting guard. He finished the game with 73 points and 7 rebounds on 73.7% shooting, but unfortunately, Denver lost the game to the Detroit Pistons 139-137. Unfortunately for Thompson, he didn't win the scoring title either, as George Gervin scored 63 points of his own later that evening. Next is Kobe Bryant in Game 6 of the first round of the 2006 playoffs. It was the second-seeded Phoenix Suns and the 7th-seeded Los Angeles Lakers, and what many people remember about this series is Kobe's iconic game winner in Game 4 and the Lakers blowing the 3-1 lead to the Suns. But Kobe did everything he could in Game 6 to try to win the series. It was the highest scoring playoff game of his career, and the array of difficult baskets he was hitting down the stretch was nothing short of amazing. Kobe finished the game with 50 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, and 3 steals on 57.1% shooting. If the Lakers had simply snagged a crucial rebound in the final moments of the game, then they would have won the series. And instead of being overlooked, this performance from Kobe would be remembered as one of the greatest of playoff history. Next on the list is John Stockton in Game 5 of the 1988 Western Conference Semifinals. It was a matchup with the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers, with the series tied at 2 games apiece. In this pivotal 5th game in Los Angeles, John Stockton had one of the best games the league has ever seen from the point guard position. He played all 48 minutes for his Jazz and poured in 23 points, 24 assists, 3 rebounds, and 5 steals on 50% shooting. His 24 assists is tied with Magic Johnson for the most assists ever accumulated in an NBA playoff game. Despite his heroic effort, it still wasn't enough to defeat the star-studded Lakers, as Michael Cooper hit the game-winning jumper with just seconds remaining, with a final score of 111-109. 7th on the list is Rajon Rondo in Game 2 of the 2012 Eastern Conference Finals. This series is obviously remembered for LeBron's evil face, and the way he dominated Game 6 in what was arguably his greatest playoff game of his career. The Miami Heat ultimately won the series in 7 games, despite Boston's best shot. Many people forget that the best player in this series wasn't any of the Celtics' famous Big Three, but it was actually their starting point, as Rondo had himself quite a ball game in Game 2 in Miami, where he dropped 44 points, 10 assists, 8 rebounds, and 3 steals on 75.1 true shooting percentage. Around this time frame, it wasn't uncommon for Rondo to put up ridiculous stat lines like this one, and I think many have already forgotten just how good prime Rondo was for a 3-season stretch with the Celtics. Last on today's list is Hakeem Olajuwon in Game 6 of the 1987 Western Conference Semifinals. He was still very young, but had all the skills to dominate the game in numerous ways, and on this night, the Seattle Supersonics got to experience the dream firsthand. Facing elimination, Hakeem mustered up one of the most clutch performances the league has ever seen from a big man, as he scored 49 points, brought down 25 rebounds, and blocked 6 shots on 57.6% shooting. Fortunately for Seattle, the extremely talented Sonics had some strong weapons of their own, and were able to win the game with a final score of 128 to 125.
So at the time I'm making this video, we're in the midst of an NBA offseason, and there's been some exciting developments that have been building anticipation for the upcoming season. So this got me wondering, what were the most exciting NBA offseasons that I can remember? Today, I put together a short list, and I'll do my best to explain why these developments were so exciting at the time they happened. Also, let me know in the comments what were some of the most exciting off-seasons to you. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, the 2009 off-season. At the very end of the 2000s, the NBA had finally reached a point where the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference were both extremely competitive simultaneously. The Lakers had just defeated the Orlando Magic in the 2009 NBA Finals, and although the Magic were still a quality team, the Boston Celtics were the Eastern Conference favorites before Kevin Garnett's season-ending knee injury. LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers also seemed as if they were on the verge of making it to the NBA Finals soon, and they were coming off of a 66-16 season that ended in disappointment at the hands of Dwight Howard and the Orlando Magic. The general feeling and consensus around the league was that most elite teams seemed like they were in a position to win a championship as long as they made one significant move in the offseason. And guess what? Just about every serious contender did just that. First off, on June 23rd, the seemingly always contending San Antonio Spurs made a major splash when they traded the aging Bruce Bowen for a 29-year-old Richard Jefferson. The Spurs viewed this acquisition as the move they needed, as San Antonio was looking for an offensive spark, and now they were bringing in a quality slasher who was averaging around 20 points per game. Now they were looking more threatening to the defending champion Lakers out west. 2 days later, the Orlando Magic made their own major move, as they traded for a 32-year-old Vince Carter, who was coming off of a season with the Nets where he had just averaged 21 points per game. Although Orlando had the #1 ranked defense in the previous season, their most common critique was that they needed more offensive support for Dwight Howard. And now, with Carter on the roster, they had just addressed that in a major way. The very next day, the Cavaliers responded with their own move to position themselves to be the best in the Eastern Conference, when they traded for a veteran Shaquille O'Neal, who was coming off of a productive season with the Phoenix Suns, where he averaged nearly 18 points and 8 rebounds on a league-best 60.9% shooting. It was not a prime Shaq, but many people still viewed this acquisition as the help that LeBron needed in order to return to the finals. Then, on July 8th, the two most recent NBA champions responded with their own significant upgrades. The defending champion Lakers added the intimidating Ron Artest, who had just averaged 17 points and was still an elite defender in the game. He had also just led his Houston Rockets to the semifinals, where he famously pushed Kobe's Lakers to 7 games. And after their intense playoff exchange, people were wondering how Kobe and Artest would get along as teammates. The Celtics responded by adding the 6'10 big man Rasheed Wallace, who brought even more championship experience and was a solid spark both offensively and defensively.
Basically every serious contender had made their moves, setting up the 09-10 season to be an absolute bloodbath. Honestly, at that point, I think that was the most excited I've ever been to be a basketball fan. Next up, the 2003 offseason. Obviously, there was that all-time great draft, where LeBron was taken first by the Cavs, Darko Milicic was taken second by the Pistons, and Carmelo Anthony was taken third by the Denver Nuggets. After that, Chris Bosh went fourth to the Toronto Raptors, and Dwayne Wade went fifth to the Miami Heat. At the time, Bosh and Wade were seen more as wild cards, but in terms of LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony, we knew that they were on their way to being all-time greats. And I was in so much anticipation to see them compete against the other elite wings of that era, like Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady, and Vince Carter. On that day, Detroit was enthusiastic about their newly acquired big man, but in the long run, he didn't make much of a difference for them. Obviously, Kobe Bryant's Colorado trial was not fun for anyone, but in terms of the pure basketball, Los Angeles was building up quite the excitement, as they created a super team by adding Gary Payton and Karl Malone, who were each coming off of seasons where they averaged 20 points per game as the best player on their squads. Many analysts were predicting this group to challenge the Bulls' 72-10 record. The San Antonio Spurs were the defending NBA champions, and were the team who had just eliminated the Lakers in the prior postseason, and put an end to their three-peat. They responded to the Lakers' acquisitions of Payton and Malone by snagging up the five-time NBA champion Robert Horry, who was previously seen as a hero in Los Angeles. Not only was this a brilliant move by San Antonio for the sake of his clutch perimeter shooting, but it also seemed like it was a way to emotionally stick it to the Lakers after they just built a super team. Unlike 2009, the anticipation of the 2003 offseason had less to do with the X's and O's of the basketball, and more to do with all of the drama between the various players and organizations. Lastly, my third choice for an insanely exciting offseason was 1996. I gotta be honest, I was very young at this point, so the memory of experiencing it is a bit hazy. But even with just my explanation of the events, it's not hard to understand why the basketball world was so intrigued by how things were unfolding. First off, the Chicago Bulls were coming off of their record-breaking 72-10 championship run, and they started their title defense off right by extending the contracts of Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, and Phil Jackson. On the other hand, almost everyone else was trying to build a team capable of dethroning the juggernaut in Chicago. The New York Knicks started by signing the lethal shooter Allen Houston to a massive long-term contract. Then, New York traded Anthony Mason to the Charlotte Hornets for a prime Larry Johnson, who had just averaged over 20 points and 8 rebounds. This team on paper looked absolutely stacked, with proven all-stars like Patrick Ewing, John Starks, Charles Oakley, Allen Houston, and Larry Johnson. They appeared as if they were the deepest team in the league, and at the time, many New Yorkers believed that this was the team that could finally defeat the Chicago Bulls. The Atlanta Hawks were already a talented team, but that offseason, they made waves when they signed the 30-year-old Dikembe Mutombo, who was a recent Defensive Player of the Year winner. Now that stacked Atlanta team was setting things up to be even tougher for the Bulls in the Eastern Conference. Out west, several teams were trying to build juggernauts of their own, starting with the San Antonio Spurs. In the previous season, David Robinson, Sean Elliott, and a talented Spurs group had won 59 regular season games, and in the offseason, they added to that immense talent by signing a veteran Dominique Wilkins, who was still a near 20 points per game scorer in his late 30s. Over in Houston, Hakeem Olajuwon and the Rockets were looking to return to their recent championship status. So in a stunning move, they made a blockbuster offseason trade, as they added a 32-year-old Charles Barkley to the mix, who was still putting up superstar numbers at that point in his career. With a starting lineup that included Hakeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, and Charles Barkley, Houston had created a terrifying super team that seemed bound to meet the Chicago Bulls in the NBA Finals. The Lakers did not have a super team, but they still made the biggest splash of that offseason by luring Shaquille O'Neal away from the Orlando Magic and signing him to a massive contract. On top of that, there was the NBA draft, where the Lakers traded for a young kid straight out of high school, Kobe Bryant. Sure, we had no idea just how good this kid would become, but even then, there was still much excitement in Los Angeles for Kobe. Even outside of Bryant, the '96 draft was one of the most hyped and highly anticipated drafts of all time. Obviously, over time, we realized that that initial excitement was well-deserved, as this became arguably the greatest draft class in the history of the NBA. Scottie Maurice Pippen. To many people, he's the greatest Robin to ever play in the NBA. And others don't even think that title is positive enough, as they claim that the Bulls dynasty was more of a Superman and Batman type of dominance. When you look at the Bulls' 6 championships in 8 years, there's no question that Scottie was an integral part of their success, and that there's absolutely no way Jordan's legacy is what it is today without his 6'7" wingman by his side. But the thing that's often forgotten, overlooked, or just never realized is that Pippen had a lot of legacy-defining moments after Michael Jordan retired from the Bulls in 1998, and I think the twilight of his career is significantly more fascinating than most people realize. After the Bulls had their last dance season, winning their 6th championship ring in franchise history, general management was determined to head in another direction and prove that they could rebuild the organization into a younger championship contender. As a result, Phil Jackson was given the door, Michael Jordan retired, and a 33-year-old Scottie Pippen was traded to the Houston Rockets in exchange for Roy Rogers and a second-round draft pick. In hindsight, this was one of the worst trades in Bulls history, as Rogers and the second-round draft pick never amounted to much of anything. On the other hand, Pippen was heading to Houston, where he was joining a starting lineup that included Hakeem Olajuwon and Charles Barkley. Now sure, when you look at an image of these 3 legends in the same uniform, it certainly looks like a super team. But before you completely jump to that conclusion, it's important to know the context of that situation. Charles Barkley was 35 years old and was not in the shape that he once was. Hakeem Olajuwon was nowhere close to his peak form, as he was 36 years old and had only played 47 games in the previous season due to injuries. Before Pippen joined, the Barkley, Drexler, and Olajuwon-led Rockets only had a 41-41 record in the 97-98 season, and they were eliminated out of the first round of the playoffs. Hypothetically, at an earlier time, a trio of Barkley, Olajuwon, and Pippen may have been one of the greatest teams of all time. But at this point, Pippen was basically joining a retirement home for NBA superstars. The 98-99 season was also a lockout-shortened season, with what I believe was the most grueling schedule in league history. Because the league took so long to agree upon a collective bargaining agreement, regular season games didn't start until February 5th of 1999. This meant that teams had to play 50 games in just 90 days. Quite often, teams had to play games on back-to-back-to-back nights. At one point, Houston had played 9 games in just 13 days. This non-stop schedule was going to be especially brutal on an older team like the Houston Rockets. With that being said, the Stars put in their best efforts, as Pippen and Olajuwon played all 50 games, and Barkley played 40 out of the 50 games. Throughout the regular season, Pippen averaged 14.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, 5.9 assists, and 2 steals on 43.2% shooting, which was reduced numbers from his previous season in Chicago. But some of that may have been because of the fact that he had to share the ball with more offensively minded stars in Houston. He provided the team some fast break basketball and was the anchor of the squad's perimeter defense, which is why he earned a first-team All-Defense selection. The Rockets finished the regular season with a 31-19 record, securing the 5th seed in the Western Conference playoffs. In the first round, they were going up against a much younger Lakers team, led by Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant. This is where things first got weird for Scottie's career after Jordan. In this specific series, Scottie likely had the worst playoff game of his career and the best playoff game of his career. Houston narrowly lost Game 1 with a final score of 101-100, but Pippen did his part, putting up 14 points, 10 rebounds, and 8 assists. But in Game 2 in Los Angeles, the Lakers were on fire from the field, while Scottie couldn't get anything going as he scored just 3 points on 0 of 7 shooting from the field. After this performance, the narrative was beginning to swirl in the media that Pippen had reached the end of his productive career. With his abilities in question and in a 0-2 hole against a younger squad, Pippen responded like the proven champion that he is, and in Game 3, he completely took over, as a helpless Kobe Bryant could do nothing to slow him down. Scottie dropped a playoff career high of 37 points and added 13 rebounds and 4 assists on 44.4% shooting, as he played all 48 minutes. He did all of that while a superstar teammate Hakeem Olajuwon only scored 5 points on 2 of 12 shooting. This resulted in a much-needed blowout victory for Houston. But in Game 4, the Lakers handled their business, closing out the series in the 4th game. Scottie attempted to go down fighting, and although he filled up the stat sheet, he didn't do it very efficiently, as he had 19 points, 17 rebounds, 5 assists, and 2 steals, on only 6 of 23 shooting. At the conclusion of that season, a frustrated Scottie requested a trade, and part of that frustration was because of his poor relationship with Charles Barkley behind the scenes. Later on, Barkley expressed his thoughts on Pippen requesting a trade, saying, "For him to want to leave after 1 year, it disappointed me greatly. The Rockets went out of their way to get Scottie, and the fans have treated him well, so I was just disappointed in him." To this, Pippen responded publicly by saying, "I wouldn't give Charles Barkley an apology at gunpoint. He can never expect an apology from me. If anything, he owes me an apology for coming to play with his fat butt."
Well, he said he would never apologize.
Not even at gunpoint.
But as you know, I always carry a gun with me. So there is a chance. There's a chance. I'm gonna go to my truck and get my gun and see. So if I get arrested for murder, y'all know he didn't apologize.
As a result, the Rockets did meet Pippen's request and traded the small forward to the Western Conference contenders, the Portland Trail Blazers. Portland was a very talented yet youthful team that was in desperate need of veteran experience and leadership, and Pippen was seen as the suitor for that role. Due to his increasing age, Scottie's minutes took a significant dip from his season in Houston, but he remained an all-around productive player, as he played all 82 games, averaging 12 points, 6 rebounds, 5 assists, and 1.4 steals on 45% shooting. He was also honored on the NBA's second all-defensive team. With a well-rounded, remarkably deep roster, the Portland Trail Blazers finished the regular season with a 59-23 record, which was good enough for the second-best record in the entire league, behind only Shaq and Kobe's Lakers. At that time, heading into the playoffs, everyone believed that these two Western Conference powerhouses were on a collision course to meet in the West Finals, but that was yet to be seen. In the first round against Kevin Garnett and the Minnesota Timberwolves, Pippen led his team in points, rebounds, and steals as they comfortably eliminated the Wolves in just 4 games. Then in the semifinals against Stockton and Malone of the Utah Jazz, Pippen led the Blazers in assists and steals, while eliminating the Jazz in just 5 games. Now the stage was set for the Lakers and Blazers, as Pippen was going up against his former championship-winning head coach. At this point in history, the Western Conference was considered to be much stronger than the East, and the belief was that whoever won this series out west would easily go on to prevail as NBA champions in the finals. In Los Angeles, the Lakers convincingly won Game 1, regardless of the fact that Pippen dropped a solid 19, 11, and 5. The Blazers then dominated Game 2 in Staples Center, stealing away home court advantage in the series. And in that game, Pippen dropped 21 points, 11 rebounds, 3 assists, and 3 steals on 60% shooting. Then stunningly, the Lakers won Games 3 and 4 in Portland, taking a demanding 3-1 lead in the series. Up to that point, no team had ever come back from a 3-1 deficit in the Western Conference Finals, so everyone was basically assuming that this was coronation time for the Lakers. But the Blazers had other plans, and showed their fighting spirit. In a do-or-die 5th game, Pippen showed up with a clutch performance, leading the Blazers in scoring while being a menace defensively. On the night, Pippen dropped 22 points, 6 rebounds, 3 assists, 6 steals, and 4 blocks on 67% shooting, resulting in a 96-88 victory. Then, back in their building for Game 6, the Blazers convincingly controlled the game, forcing a Game 7 in Los Angeles with a final score of 103-93. Under Scottie Pippen's leadership, the Blazers were just 1 game away from completing one of the greatest comebacks in playoff history, but they were going to have to do it in Los Angeles. The Blazers had the momentum on their side, and that continued after the tip-off of Game 7. For the vast majority of the game, the Blazers seemed to be in complete control, and Staples Center was awfully quiet. At the end of the first quarter, Portland had a 7-point lead, and at the end of the third quarter, that lead had increased to 13. Pippen was having himself a solid game, and through 3 quarters, he had 12 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 assists, leading his team in 2 of those stats. But that's when seemingly everything changed. When the fourth quarter began, the Lakers were blistering hot, while the Blazers couldn't buy a bucket. For an 8-minute stretch of the fourth quarter, the Blazers didn't convert a single field goal, missing a total of 13 straight shots. Scottie Pippen specifically had 0 points on 0 of 3 shooting with 3 fouls and 1 turnover, in a quarter he desperately wishes he could have back. Shaq, Kobe, and the rest of the Lakers had completely stolen the momentum, and the rest was history, as they defeated the Blazers in Game 7, eventually going on to win the NBA championship over the Indiana Pacers. Many people don't realize this, but given the fact that the West was expected to dominate the East, regardless of who the conference winners were, Scottie was basically 1 quarter away from winning another championship ring as the leader of his squad. He was 1 quarter away from defeating Phil Jackson and surpassing Michael Jordan in the championship ring count. Unfortunately, this was Pippen's last real shot at an additional championship ring, as his Blazers were swept out of the first round of the playoffs in the next 2 seasons by the clearly superior Lakers team, meaning that Pippen was eliminated by the Lakers in 4 straight seasons. At the end of the day, Scottie Pippen is much more than simply a sidekick to Michael Jordan. But when we look at his career post-Jordan, we see that he had one of the weirder rollercoaster finales of an NBA Hall of Famer, as it included drama, remarkable highs, and some terrible, remarkable lows. The NBA has 2 major conferences, the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference, and for as long as the NBA has been a thing, the winner of each conference are the teams who play in the NBA Finals. The thing is, that doesn't necessarily mean that the 2 best teams in the league are being represented in the NBA Finals, because decently often, the 2 best teams in the league are actually within the same conference. Today, we're looking at 4 instances where the 2 best teams were clearly battling in the conference finals, rather than the NBA Finals. Let's get into it. First off, the 1971 West Finals. The winner of the East Conference was about as improbable of a winner as they come. Although the Baltimore Bullets had quality star players like Wes Unseld and Earl Monroe, they were a pretty average team throughout the regular season, both offensively and defensively, which is why they barely snuck into the playoffs with a 42-40 record. Somehow, they played far above their expectations when the playoffs began, as they won every series in 7 games up until the NBA Finals. Meanwhile, in the Western Conference, 2 championship-caliber teams were battling it out for a trip to the game's biggest stage. It was the Los Angeles Lakers, led by Wilt Chamberlain and Gil Goodrich, up against the dynamic duo of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson of the Milwaukee Bucks. Headlining the matchup was a battle of 2 of the greatest centers of all time, as both Kareem and Wilt had fantastic showings throughout the series. Ultimately, Kareem and the Bucks were just too much for the Lakers, as they closed them out in 5 games. Although that wasn't the longest series, there was still little doubt that both of those teams would have easily handled the Bullets, who were in way over their heads being in the finals in the first place. As expected, Kareem and the Bucks destroyed the overachieving Bullets, sweeping them in 4 games and winning nearly every game by a double-digit margin. Next is the 2002 West Finals. I gotta be honest, I think out of every series on this list, this one was the most obvious that the championship winner was coming from the Western Conference Finals. The New Jersey Nets were a solid team, but at this point in history, it was widely recognized that the Western Conference as a whole was far superior to the East. The Western Conference Finals were a matchup between the Sacramento Kings and the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers. At the time, these two teams had a fierce rivalry, and throughout the regular season, it was basically a foregone conclusion amongst basketball circles that these two teams would meet up in the West Finals. The Kings had won 61 games throughout the regular season, and the Lakers had won 58 as a 3rd seed. Meanwhile, the New Jersey Nets won only 52 games throughout the regular season, yet they had the best record in the entire Eastern Conference by a couple of games. That should tell you all you need to know about the disparity between the East and the West during that era. The Lakers and Kings series was an absolute classic, but it was also a series mired with controversy. At the end of the day, the Lakers won the series in overtime of the 7th game, and we all knew what would happen next. In the finals, the Lakers took their victory lap by sweeping the New Jersey Nets in 4 games, confirming what we all basically knew before the playoffs even started. Next up, the 2009 West Finals. That season, the winner of the Eastern Conference was the Dwight Howard-led Orlando Magic, and although they were a solid team, their road to the finals was a bit easier than it should have been, considering how the defending champion Boston Celtics lost their superstar Kevin Garnett to a knee injury before the playoffs began. If it wasn't for the injury, everyone would have expected a finals rematch between the Lakers and the Celtics in the finals. Now, the Western Conference Finals was a matchup between the motivated Los Angeles Lakers and the extremely hot Denver Nuggets. Now, the Magic did have a better record than the Denver Nuggets, as the Magic won 59 games throughout the regular season, while the Nuggets won only 54. But you have to consider that the Magic were playing a majority of their games against a weaker Eastern Conference, while the Nuggets were battling it out with a much tougher West. The other part you have to consider is how the Nuggets were building team chemistry throughout the season. Early during that season, the Nuggets traded Allen Iverson to the Detroit Pistons for the former Finals MVP Chauncey Billups. Although Iverson was certainly the bigger name, Billups was the better fit. The thing is, Denver had to build their chemistry throughout the season, but by the time the playoffs had rolled along, they were one of the hottest teams in the entire league. Kobe and Carmelo had epic individual battles throughout the West Finals, and at that point, everyone seemed to recognize that whoever won this series was going to win the NBA championship. Well, you guys know how this played out. Kobe and the Lakers won the series in 6 hard-fought games and advanced to the NBA Finals. And as expected, they made quick work of the vastly inferior Orlando Magic, comfortably winning in only 5 games. Lastly is the 2018 Western Conference Finals. For LeBron James fans, this season is remembered fondly for James's incredible effort throughout the regular season and the postseason, carrying his Cavs to the NBA Finals. Most people recognize how the Eastern Conference was weaker during this time, which aided LeBron's trip to the finals. Regardless, his incredible run was still impressive. One of the reasons LeBron's run was so improbable was the fact that this was his first season without Kyrie Irving by his side. When you look at that Cavs roster from top to bottom, anyone who knows basketball could see how they didn't have the same level of talent as the top 2 teams in the Western Conference. Those squads were the juggernaut Golden State Warriors and the 65-17 Houston Rockets. This is recent enough history that you guys probably know all of the details. Houston and Golden State had an epic 7-game series that looked like either team was capable of winning. Although the Warriors did end up closing out the series in the decisive 7th game, the Rockets' starting point guard and their second best player, Chris Paul, suffered a season-ending injury in the 5th game with the series tied at 2 games apiece. With Paul out of the lineup, the Rockets were incapable of reaching their ceiling, which ultimately led to the Warriors closing it out. The Warriors then went on to sweep LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA Finals. And in Game 1, it took one of the greatest performances of LeBron's life to even keep the game close. Not only do I believe the championship was decided in the West Finals, but the Rockets also won both of their regular season matchups against Cleveland that year by an average margin of 18 points. Whether it would have been the Rockets or the Warriors, I think either team would have made quick work of Cleveland in 2018.
For as long as the NBA has been in existence, star players have been making their mark on the league with what we call signature moves. They may have not necessarily been the inventor or the originator of the move, but in these cases, they were the first to implement it as a regular and lethal part of their game. The thing is, for various reasons, people often get it wrong when it comes down to these signature moves. We often acknowledge a more recent player, probably for the simple fact that it's what the wider audience is familiar with. But with a more broad understanding of basketball history, we begin to understand how that can be somewhat disrespectful to the players who were doing it before them. Today, we're looking at a handful of players who I believe are incorrectly given credit as the originators of their moves. First off, Steph Curry and the Deep Three. I'll admit, it's not common for a player to willingly take three-point shots several feet beyond the line, especially in the 90s. But with that being said, there was at least a couple players who were doing it. The first one that comes to mind was the Phoenix Suns' Stan Marley. Marley played for several teams throughout the course of his career, but it was in Phoenix where he truly made a name for himself as he made 3 All-Star teams and was arguably the most reliable 3-and-D type of player in the entire league. To this day, it slightly annoys me when people act like Steph was the first player to willingly shoot several feet beyond the 3-point line. Because even as a younger basketball fan, I remember Marley doing this with regularity in Phoenix. Not as often as players in the modern game, of course, but it was often enough for it to be seen as his own signature move. Many of Marley's bombs were also provided in clutch moments, where his team absolutely needed each point. Although I truly believe that Marley was the pioneer of this, there was a few other players who would do it occasionally as well, like Portland's Rasheed Wallace, Vince Carter, and even Kobe Bryant with his heat check shots. Second up is Dirk Nowitzki and the Dirk Fade. Dirk Nowitzki's fadeaway jumper has become iconic, and given the fact that he's a 7-footer, it's one of the most difficult shots to defend of basketball history. Stylistically, it's very different from the fadeaways of guys like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. But with that being said, he still wasn't the first player to regularly implement this style into his jump shot. Decades before Dirk ever played his first professional game, Wilton Norman Chamberlain was scoring over the top of centers with that style of a fadeaway. Contrary to popular belief, this was a pretty common method of scoring from Wilt, as it was not only well known among his peers, but there's also entire compilation videos on YouTube of Wilt making these shots. Seeing how he had an extremely high release point, how he's 7 foot 1 inches tall with a 7 foot 8 inch wingspan, and how he had an elite vertical leap, Wilt bolstered arguably the most indefensible fadeaway that the game has ever seen. Even in his prime, when Chamberlain was averaging 50 points a game, many of those baskets were coming from his Dirk-like fadeaway on a nightly basis. Next is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the skyhook shot. Speaking of difficult shots to defend, one of the rarest and most famous came from the Lakers captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The skyhook shot usually comes from a player who plays the center position, and with its sky-high release point, there's very little the opposing player can do to alter it. The vast majority of Kareem's 38,000 points were scored with this move, so obviously it comes as no surprise that it's most often associated with the NBA's all-time leading scorer. The thing is, he wasn't the originator of this move, not even close, as many players were doing it for decades before him. The first superstar to incorporate it into his game and use it with extreme lethality was the first Lakers legend, George Mikan. Not only did the 6'10" big man win numerous championships as the Lakers' leader, but he was also the man who frequently carried the team offensively, and the bread and butter of his offensive arsenal was his skyhook shot. If I haven't yet made my point of just how powerful and integral this shot was to his game, consider this. For 3 straight years, Mikan led the league in scoring with a near 30 points per game average, and he did this at a time when entire teams were averaging around 80 points per night. It was Mikan's dominant skyhook that made that kind of an offensive impact possible. Next is Isaiah Ryder and the East Bay Funk Dunk.
The between the legs dunk has become a staple of the NBA dunk contest, and it doesn't appear to be leaving anytime soon. Players continuously try to find different variations of this dunk as a means to gain higher scores with the judges. The thing is, the popular belief among basketball fans is that Isaiah Ryder introduced it in 1994, Kobe Bryant solidified it in 1997, and Vince Carter made it iconic in 2000. But before each and every one of those instances, a player did the between the legs dunk in a dunk contest, but unfortunately, no one seemed to remember it. It came by a gifted athlete by the name of Orlando Woolridge in 1984. This was actually the first dunk contest of NBA history, and the winner of that contest was actually the Phoenix Suns' Larry Nance. With that being said, it was Woolridge who made history earlier in the contest when he made this East Bay dunk. The response from the audience was somewhat tame, as they didn't realize the history that they just witnessed. Apparently, some of the judges didn't either, as Orlando's dunk only amassed a total of 48 points. This dunk went so under the radar that many basketball fans still believe that Ryder was the originator of it in the NBA. But if you ever hear any fans say such a thing, be sure to remind them of this forgotten gem. Lastly is LeBron James and the chase down block. I will not argue that LeBron isn't the greatest chase down blocker of all time, but on that note, you would be wrong to think that he was the first player to do it with some level of regularity. Among his many skills, chase down blocks were a legitimate part of Hakeem Olajuwon's game, as he had the speed, length, and athleticism to catch up to opposing players and punish them for going up softly. He didn't do it as often as LeBron has, but it was certainly within the Hall of Famer's skill set, and a couple of those instances were in some tremendously significant playoff games.
The game of basketball was created in December of 1891 by YMCA gym teacher James Naismith in Springfield, Massachusetts. To create the game, he used a peach basket, a 10-foot pole, and a soccer ball. In 1891, the first ever basketball game was played between Naismith's students. It took quite a while, but a point was eventually scored, and basketball's first ever game concluded with an epic final score of 1-0. James Naismith would adjust the rules of the game over the next 20 years, and the game would continue to evolve. In 1892, dribbling became a legal move. In 1893, the first ever women's collegiate basketball game was played. In 1895, the popularity of basketball spread, and basketball became an established sport that was played through numerous high schools and college universities. By 1901, basketball collegiate competition was taking place all around the United States. As the years went on, Naismith added a backboard and created a leather basketball. In 1906, an iron ring with a woven net was used and replaced peach baskets. In the 1920s, small basketball leagues were forming around the country. Among these groups that formed were the Harlem Globetrotters, whose flashy and entertaining style helped spread basketball's popularity. In 1936, basketball officially became an Olympic sport, with the gold medal game played outside in raining conditions. In 1937, professional basketball established the NBL, meaning the National Basketball League, which became the first official pro basketball league. In 1939, NCAA basketball held their first official championship tournament. In 1946, competition arose for the NBL. The BAA, which means the Basketball Association of America, was established by Walter Brown. The NBL's popularity was slightly greater than the new BAA, but the BAA was quickly on the rise, while hosting major basketball games in the Boston Garden and Madison Square Garden. From 1946 to 1949, the two leagues competed intensely to be the top basketball league in America. That was until August of 1949. Leaders of the NBL and the BAA met at the Empire State Building, and the two groups agreed to a merger of both leagues, which became the National Basketball Association, or of course as we know it, the NBA. George Mikan was just beginning his basketball career in the mid-1940s and became the first NBA star in a league that would become all about stars. In 1954, the 24-second shot clock was introduced to the NBA to expedite the game's tempo. In 1956, Bill Russell was drafted by the Boston Celtics, which was the beginning of the NBA's greatest dynasty in history.
On March 2, 1962, Wilt Chamberlain had the greatest scoring performance in NBA history, individually scoring 100 points in a single game. In 1970, Oscar Robertson, a legendary NBA player and former president of the NBA Players Association, filed an antitrust lawsuit against the NBA. The suit was settled in 1976, which resulted in the creation of NBA free agency, which allowed player mobility by choice of the players. In 1976, the NBA and the ABA, which was the American Basketball Association, merged into one league. The NBA treated it as an expansion and absorbed 4 teams from the ABA, increasing the league from 18 to 22 teams. In the 1970s, the league's popularity had taken hits amidst on-court violence and alarming amounts of drug abuse throughout the association. In 1978, Larry Bird was drafted by the Boston Celtics, and in 1979, Magic Johnson was drafted by the Los Angeles Lakers. This sparked the greatest rivalry in NBA history, which led the NBA to record heights of popularity and viewership. And Magic and Bird are now commonly seen as the saviors of the NBA. In 1984, Michael Jordan was drafted by the Chicago Bulls. Michael would be the one to take the torch from Bird and Magic, and Jordan would carry the league to new heights throughout the 1990s. In 1992, the USA Olympic basketball team included NBA players for the first time in Olympic history. Led by Jordan, Magic, and Bird, the Dream Team dominated the Barcelona Summer Olympics, and the team is commonly credited for increasing the NBA's popularity onto a global scale. After Jordan's final retirement in 2003, players like Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Tim Duncan, Allen Iverson, and Steph Curry took the torch and have helped the NBA's brand grow into the league we know and love today. If you've ever been a part of NBA debates that involve discussions about the 1980s, then you know that people can be pretty divided on their opinions on the style and quality of basketball that came from that era, and even about what that era represented. As someone who loves that era of NBA basketball and who has personally watched hundreds of hours throughout my life of it, I feel like I can offer a bit of clarification on how people can accurately view this decade. I want to start by tackling several aspects about the decade and talk about what's true, what isn't true, and what you might have not known. First, we'll start with one of the most argued over topics, defense. The current perception of 80s defense depends on who you ask. If you ask a fan from an older generation, more often than not, they're going to tell you that defense was greater at that time, that back then, they played grown man defense. They would always punish each other physically back then, and nowadays, they can barely even touch each other. This is their narrative. But if you ask a lot of younger fans, they don't have to deal with the nostalgia bias, but they also have the disadvantage of not actually watching those games. Those younger fans will say things like defense was less advanced back then, and that it was easier to score and not as physical as advertised. There's even compilation videos on YouTube of bad defense from the 80s, where guys are given little resistance and minimal hustle and effort is on display. So what gives? You've got two different groups saying totally opposite things about a specific decade. Well, as usual, the truth lies somewhere in the middle and a little off to the side. Let's start with the facts and details we know about 80s basketball. In today's current NBA, teams average 111.7 points per game, which is really high. It's actually the highest since the days Wilt Chamberlain played basketball. Now, the 1980s was actually very close in total offense. Throughout that decade, teams usually averaged around 109 points per game, which is also a lot of offense. Not only that, but throughout the 80s, teams shot 48% from the field compared to today's 46%. In fact, in terms of field goal percentage, the 1980s were the most efficient decade in all of NBA history. I could break down all the statistical league averages in detail, but here's what you need to know. Today, the league is very high scoring. The 2000s were very low, the late 90s were very low, the early 90s were high, and the 1980s were very high. So immediately, at face value, it appears the 80s defensive era narrative has been pretty overblown, based on how many points they were scoring and how efficiently they were scoring. But what we need to understand was that the biggest contributing factor to this was the pace of play. The 1980s was some of the most fast-break, transition-heavy basketball the league has ever seen. In today's game, most of the very high scoring comes from the inflation of three-point attempts. But in the 80s, it was more due to the fact that most games looked like a track meet. The Showtime Lakers of the 80s were famous for this, since Magic Johnson was always pushing the tempo. But it wasn't just them. Many teams played a fast break style, like the Denver Nuggets, who were notorious for their incredibly fast and potent offense, but also a terrible defense. The Pistons, despite their defensive perception, also ran the fast break a lot and could score a ton of points. And there were also teams like Phoenix, Dallas, Portland, and Philadelphia. So transition basketball was pretty much the norm in those days. And what do you get with a lot of fast breaks? Plenty of layups and dunks, which are easier opportunities. Easier opportunities equals a higher field goal percentage. The highest scoring game in NBA history actually came from this era, which was on December 13, 1983, when the Detroit Pistons defeated the Denver Nuggets in triple overtime, 186 to 184. These were the Pistons, who were known for their physicality, their Jordan rules, and their overall punishing defense. So how in the world could this defensively revered squad be involved in a game where the final score was in the 180s? It's starting to sound like this whole defensive era thing is just a huge myth. Well, we're not done yet. And that brings us to the next aspect that goes somewhat hand in hand with this one, physicality. One of the biggest influences in the different eras that people don't usually think of is the flagrant foul rule. Most of you know the details of the flagrant foul, but for those who don't, it's a foul where unnecessary roughness is used on another player. Many times it's called when there is a blow to the head or strong physical contact that was in no way a play on the basketball. Committing this flagrant foul can be devastating to the team that does it, because it results in either 1 or 2 free throws and maintained possession of the ball, and often an ejection of the player who committed the foul. This is a pretty good rule. It keeps players protected, it keeps players from unnecessary serious injuries, and it often keeps tense moments from escalating into really ugly situations. And this rule did not exist until 1990. That means that in the fullness of the 1980s, almost every hard foul was just considered a common foul. If this is the case, doesn't it make sense to hit the offensive player a little harder to make sure he doesn't get an and one? Doesn't it make sense to put a little extra on it if it means they think twice before attacking the basket next time? The games in the 80s weren't always played with this physically punishing nature, only when they needed to be, like for the Jordan rules or in the NBA playoffs. In the postseason, where every possession and every point counts, players would often exercise this freedom for the sake of trying to win the ball game. It wasn't that this generation of players was naturally more violent, it's that they were allowed to be. The truth is, just like modern basketball, there were players who played great defense, and there were players who played terrible defense. The key differences were the high-octane pace of play and the permissible hard fouls. In the 1980s, it was possible to have both a league where teams could score into the 120s and a league where games would become very physical and the style would change significantly. There was a term back in the day that was common among players, coaches, referees, and commentators: setting the tone. You don't hear it much anymore in today's game, but back then it was very important, and it essentially meant that they were coming out of the gates to start the game, setting the tone for the game's pace, style, and physicality. Nowadays, the game is much more consistent in terms of its style and physicality, because the rules have become much more clear on what is acceptable and what's not, what is permissible contact and what isn't. In the 80s, it was easier for players to control the game and more difficult for the referees to control the game, because pretty much anything goes. For example, it was common for teams like the Celtics and Pistons to be even more physical in matchups with the Lakers, trying to take them out of their finesse style of basketball. They came out of the gates, setting the tone, and oftentimes, it worked. The next aspect is athleticism. You've heard it, and I've heard it. The idea that players back then were slower, weaker, and smaller than modern-day athletes. Is it somewhat accurate? Probably. Is it also grossly exaggerated? Probably that too. In the past 10 years of modern NBA basketball, the average height of the NBA player is 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighs 220.7 pounds. In the 10 years of the 1980s, the average height was also 6 foot 7 inches tall and the average weight was 207 pounds. So although they stood just as tall side to side to one another, the major difference was the weight of the players at nearly 14 pounds less. Simply put, this difference was usually made up of muscle mass. Modern players have an advantage with modern training methods, eating habits, and fitness routines. Guys in the 80s were simply skinnier, but many of them were still very athletic and had lean muscle. They just overall looked a little less physically imposing than today's players. This has partially led some newer fans to criticize this era when they're looking at some of the most non-threatening and least athletic players of the 80s. They'll say things like the league was packed with part-time plumbers and accountants. I hate it when people say this though, because it's easy to take small samples and condemn an entire era for it. It's almost like when people think of the state of athleticism in 2020, they automatically think of Giannis. And when they think of the state of athleticism in the 90s, they think of Jeff Hornacek. The problem with that is that it's erring on an extreme example, and isn't a proper survey of the athleticism of the league as a whole at that time. Want another example? Picture 20 years from now. People are hating on LeBron James, saying he didn't play in a strong era of real athleticism, and here's their future arguments. How strong is LeBron's era in 2016 when he lost the MVP race to a guy who struggles to dunk a basketball? How strong could that era have been when one of the best players in the league was someone who was consistently overweight? In LeBron's era, he played against plumbers like JJ Redick and Kelly Olynyk. How weak were the athletes in LeBron's era if a guy who was only 5 foot 9 inches tall could average nearly 30 points per game? Don't you guys see how ridiculous and biased these statements are? Although many of the statements are true to an extent, they're cherry-picking details and acting as if it's the complete picture. They're completely lacking context, but statements like these are usually just emotionally motivated agendas in order to build a negative narrative about a player that they don't like as much as their favorite player. People do this all the time with the 1980s. But when you look around the league in that era as a whole, you see guys who were incredible athletes like Dominique Wilkins, Kenny Skywalker, Michael Jordan, Daryl Dawkins, Charles Barkley, Gerald Wilkins, Julius Erving, Sean Kemp, Xavier McDaniel, Hakeem Olajuwon, Karl Malone, James Worthy, Tom Chambers, Darrell Griffith, David Thompson, Terrence Stansbury, Clyde Drexler, Larry Nance, Dennis Rodman, Orlando Woolridge, David Robinson, Roy Hinson. Seriously, do I need to keep going? Many people are just too young or weren't watching at that time to know about a lot of the freakishly gifted athletes of the 1980s, just like how 20 to 30 years from now, many people won't know about many of the great athletes we watch in today's game. The final aspect is competition. I'll make this one quick, but since the 1960s when the Boston Celtics ruled the basketball world, the 1980s were the toughest era of competition in terms of how hard it was to break through and win a championship. That was because the 80s were, as I call it, the era of super teams. There was so much talent at the top of the league, and you had several dynasty-worthy rosters consistently duking it out. Part of that was how the league was rich with stars, but the other part was how there were only 23 teams in the league. Imagine today's NBA, and then we eliminate 7 of the teams, and then distribute the talent from those teams to the remaining 23 teams. Naturally, what would you get? A handful of super teams. This was essentially the NBA in the 1980s. Look around the teams of the league and who won championships in that decade. If you had just 1 or 2 stars on your team in that era, you're not winning a championship. You needed 3 or 4 and a deep bench just to even win 1 ring. With all this being said, am I saying that the 80s was the greatest era of basketball? Not necessarily, but it was a great era, with a crazy history, and with a fantastic collection of talent and athletes, and it certainly deserves your respect.
This is a topic I've wanted to tackle for a while, because it's something that has people pretty divided whenever it comes up. And as one of the ultimate Kobe Bryant fans who watched basically the entirety of his basketball career, I thought I should give my perspective on it as well. Now, when it comes to Kobe's abilities as an offensive player, there isn't a tremendous amount to be debated. Simply put, he's one of the greatest scorers in NBA history. He's currently 4th on the NBA's all-time scoring list. He has the 2nd greatest scoring performance of all time, which is when he dropped 81 points on the Raptors. And he has the longest streak of 40-point games and 50-point games by anyone not named Wilt Chamberlain. If you ask me personally, I don't think Kobe was the greatest scorer in NBA history, but I do believe he was the most impressive scorer of all time, as no one could consistently make the insanely difficult shots that he could make on a regular basis. To me, this aspect of Kobe's legacy is unwavering, and most people tend to agree that he's one of the greatest scorers of all time. But then, there's the other side of the court, and this is where things get a bit more shaky.
If I asked you if Kobe Bryant was one of the greatest defensive players in NBA history, what would your answer be? He certainly has the reputation of being a great defensive player, and in numerous instances, Kobe displayed what he was capable of on that end of the court. To me, the greatest example of Kobe's tenacity and defensive excellence was when he led the Redeem team in the 2008 Summer Olympics. Kobe understood full well that with that stacked roster of offensive superstars, he wouldn't need to be as aggressive offensively, and instead decided to focus his energy on the defensive end of the court. That summer, he accepted the assignment of shutting down the best player on the opposing teams. And Kobe's Olympic teammates have spoken at length about how his mindset and leadership motivated the team defensively, which helped them secure the gold. At least in that time frame, Kobe was absolutely elite defensively, as he demonstrated his lockdown abilities when he set his mind to it. But that begs the question, did Kobe always set his mind on being a lockdown defensive player? Here's something to consider. In the history of the NBA, Kobe is tied for the most first-team all-defensive selections with a total of 9. The players he is tied with are Michael Jordan, Kevin Garnett, and Gary Payton. So based on that, some may consider him on the same level as those other defensive players. Well, the thing is, of the players in that group, Kobe is the only player who never won the Defensive Player of the Year award. Jordan won the award in 1988, Gary Payton won it in 1996, and Kevin Garnett won it in 2008. In fact, Kobe never finished higher than 3rd overall in the DPOY race, and other than that single season in 2000, he never finished higher than 5th. Now some bring up the point that the all-defensive selections and the DPOY award is all based on voting by the media. So in a sense, there's no objective truth to a player being considered as better or worse based on those awards, because it all comes down to their opinions. While there is some truth to that point, you also have to consider the aspects that are less about opinions and more about the bottom line. For example, defensive statistics. Given how Jordan and Kobe have the same amount of first-team all-defensive selections, and Kobe actually has more defensive selections overall, let's focus a bit on a comparison between these two defensively, seeing how they both play at the same position and with similar styles. Jordan specialized as a defensive pickpocket. He was good at reading defenses and jumping the passing lanes. With his massive hands and with his tremendous strength, he was also very good at stripping the ball from the opposing ball handler. In Jordan's first 9 seasons before his retirement in 1993, he didn't have a single season where he didn't average at least 2 steals per game. In 3 of those seasons, he actually led the league in steals per game. On the other hand, Kobe only had 1 season in his 20-year career where he averaged at least 2 steals per game, and he never once led the league in that category. Despite the fact that Kobe played 5 more seasons and nearly 300 more games in his career, Jordan actually leads Bryant on the all-time steals list by nearly 600 steals. To put it simply, when it comes to forcing turnovers and stripping the ball from the opponent, MJ was on another level entirely. So let's look at another aspect of defense, blocking shots. Earlier in Kobe's career was when he was at his best as a shot blocker, which makes sense since his explosiveness and his vertical leap was at its greatest during his Froby days. With that being said, Kobe only had 1 season in his entire NBA career where he averaged at least 1 block per game, and that was a lockout-shortened season in 1999. On the other hand, Jordan had 4 seasons where he averaged at least 1 block per game, getting as high as 1.6 in 1988, which is actually the highest blocks per game average by a guard in NBA history. Along with that, MJ also had a higher career average than Kobe as well. There are other stats that should factor into this comparison as well, like advanced stats, and one of the examples of that is defensive win shares. At Kobe's best in the year 2000, he had a grand total of 4.5 defensive win shares over the course of that season. On the other hand, Jordan exceeded that total in 9 different seasons of his career, getting as high as 6.2 in 1996. Now listen, clearly all of these defensive stats are in favor of MJ. And I'm not bringing these up in an attempt to slander Kobe by any means, as he was at the very least a very good defensive player, but I'm simply pointing out that there's layers to this thing. Now, with all of these stats mentioned, some might want to point out that defensive statistics aren't always the best metric to understand the greatness of a defensive player. And you know what? That's a decent point. For example, Dennis Rodman is widely recognized as one of the greatest players of all time by pretty much everyone. Yet Rodman was nothing terribly impressive from a statistical standpoint, as he never had one season where he averaged at least 1 steal or 1 block in the entirety of his NBA career. Some of you may be wondering, if that's the case, what makes him a great defensive player? Well, that would be his skill that doesn't show up on the stat sheet, which is his smothering on-ball defense. A defender can be all over the offensive player and be consistently forcing him into making bad passes and taking bad shots. And for the most part, this wonderful defensive quality will not show up on the stat sheet. So with that in mind, let's revisit the comparison and evaluate how good Kobe was as an on-ball defender. A lot of this relies on personal experience and the eye test. From my observations, Kobe was a much better on-ball defender earlier in his career, as he began conserving some of his energy as he got later into his career. I also believe that Kobe was what I call a situational defender. The Mamba was the kind of elite defensive player who would pick his spots, based on the gravity of the moment, who he's up against, and what he's trying to prove. I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone when I say that Kobe didn't always have the same intensity defensively as he had in the 2008 Summer Olympics. That's because he picks his spots, and that was a spot he picked. Obviously, we've all seen the highlights of Kobe putting the clamps on guys like Dwayne Wade and Kyrie Irving, and in large part, that was because Kobe accepted the challenge of a one-on-one superstar matchup. That was a spot he picked. But as a longtime Lakers fan, I also remember many instances where Kobe got a little lazy on defense and maybe relied a little too heavily on guys like Andrew Bynum to contest his cutting man at the rim. Although Kobe was capable of being the best defender on the court at any time, I also don't remember him bringing his best effort as consistently as guys like Jordan and Rodman. Don't just take it from me though, take it from his championship head coach, Phil Jackson. In his book called The Last Season, which was about the 2004 Lakers, the Zen Master had this to say about the Mamba. Kobe's defense, to be accurate, has faltered in recent years, despite his presence on the league's all-defensive team. The voters have been seduced by his remarkable athleticism and spectacular steals, but he hasn't played sound, fundamental defense. Mesmerized by the ball, he gambles too frequently, putting us out of position, forcing rotations that leave a man wide open, and doesn't keep his feet on the ground. This was Phil's honest perspective after the team imploded with their finals loss in 2004. Since Jackson was then retired at that point, that was probably the most genuine response we could have got from him. That was far from the last time that Phil would comment on Kobe's defensive abilities. And around the year 2010, Phil said that Kobe started winning some of his defensive selections based off of his tenacious reputation and not so much of his actual play on the court. Now, it's no secret that Phil liked to play mind games with his players, and it's possible that he was saying this as a way of motivating his star player to step up his game. Now, whether or not that was the case, I kind of agree with Phil's assessment. Although Kobe made a total of 12 all-defense teams, a total of 9 or 10 probably would have been more accurate, as it appeared clear to me that he had become vastly more selective about giving his best defensive efforts. So at the end of the day, where do I stand on Kobe's defensive abilities? Well, like I said before, he was a top defensive player who was capable of being the best defender on the court any given night, and many times he was. The problem with his defense, according to Phil Jackson and myself, is that Kobe wasn't as consistent as other great defenders, and he didn't have the longevity in that area either. In my own words, I would say that Kobe was a very, very good defensive player. But unlike some other Kobe fans, I think it's a step too far to say that he was one of the greatest defensive players of all time. Throughout the decades, there have been several superstar players who have dominated the league. And then, on the other hand, there have been other star players who became victims of that dominance. Today's video is about the NBA legends who ruined, or at the very least, greatly altered the legacy of another star player. And let me know in the comments what you think are some other examples. Without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Larry Bird, who ruined the legacy of Sidney Moncrief. All of you know who Larry Bird is. He was a 3-time NBA champion, a 3-time MVP, an all-around skillful threat everywhere on the court, and simply one of the top 10 greatest basketball players of all time. Let's be real, this 6'9" assassin doesn't need much more of an introduction. On the other hand, there's Sidney Moncrief. This 6'4" guard was one of the great two-way players of NBA history, as he was actually the first Defensive Player of the Year in 1983, and he's the only guard who's ever won the award multiple times. At his peak, he was averaging more than 22 points per game, and he was a perennial All-Star, earning a selection in 5 straight seasons. He was the leader of the Milwaukee Bucks franchise throughout the majority of the 1980s, as they were talented enough to be considered as frequent title contenders. Unfortunately for Moncrief, he was playing on an Eastern Conference contender at the same time that a prime Larry Bird was, and more often than not, when their paths crossed, Bird showed no mercy whatsoever. Things started off looking bright for the Bucks though. The two teams met up in the 1983 Eastern Conference semifinals, and the Bucks brought their best effort, as Moncrief put up these strong averages over the course of the series. On the other hand, Larry was hindered by an intense case of the flu that actually caused him to miss Game 2. At the end of the day, the second-seeded Bucks stunningly swept the third-seeded Boston Celtics, and Larry Bird said it was a massive embarrassment that he would never forget for the rest of his life. Well, it would seem that Bird took that moment personally, because he would never let Moncrief and the Bucks ever defeat him again. In the following season, both teams appeared to be even stronger, as the first-seeded Celtics met with the second-seeded Bucks in the 1984 Eastern Conference Finals. The series wasn't nearly as competitive as many expected it to be, as Bird was on an absolute mission, and over the course of the series, he dropped these monstrous averages, leading the Celtics' entire team in points, rebounds, assists, and steals, on remarkable efficiency. The Celtics comfortably eliminated the Bucks in 5 games, and obviously, this prevented Moncrief from making his first trip to the NBA Finals. 2 years later, the teams met up again in the 1986 Eastern Conference Finals. Bird had a series for the ages, as he nearly averaged a triple-double on absolutely goofy efficiency splits. Milwaukee never stood a chance, as Larry and the Celtics swept them in just 4 games, with an average margin of victory of 15 points. This was now the second straight season that Bird kept Moncrief from reaching the NBA Finals. The following year, the two teams met in the playoffs for the 4th time in just 5 seasons, and it was in the 1987 Eastern Conference semifinals. With the recent acquisitions of Jack Sikma and John Lucas, Milwaukee was poised to put up a greater fight than the previous season, and they did just that. Facing elimination in Game 6, Sidney Moncrief produced an epic performance as he dropped 34 points, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 steals on 55% shooting. They pushed Bird and the Celtics to a 7th game in Boston, but at the end of the day, Larry Legend was once again too much, as he put up 30, 10, and 8 in the decisive game, and the Celtics took home the win, with a final score of 119-113. Yet again, Bird had a dominant series, filling up the stat sheet across the board. In my opinion, Moncrief is already regarded as one of the most underrated players in basketball history. But because of Bird, he was denied several trips to the NBA Finals, and he may have even gone on to win an NBA championship, which would have certainly made him a legendary figure in the city of Milwaukee. To this day, many young basketball fans have never even heard of Sidney Moncrief, but I promise you, that wouldn't be the case if Larry Bird never existed. Next up, LeBron James ruined the legacy of DeMar DeRozan. This one is recent history, so it's not like I'm breaking any major news here. LeBron has the famous nickname LeBronto for an extremely good reason. For a while, he was punishing the Raptors year after year, and the player who suffered the most for that reality is DeMar DeRozan. For a while, people were considering DeRozan for the title of the greatest Toronto Raptor in franchise history. But the thing is, since DeRozan was traded in the summer of 2018, Kyle Lowry and Kawhi Leonard became NBA champions with the organization, which was the franchise's first and only title ever. DeMar could have been the first superstar to lead Toronto to the NBA Finals, and potentially win a championship. But of course, LeBron got in the way, time and time again. It started in the 2016 Eastern Conference Finals, where the first-seeded Cavs were taking on the second-seeded Raptors. DeRozan had a solid series of his own, but it hardly mattered as LeBron efficiently dominated the series. They met up again the following year in the 2017 Eastern Conference Semifinals, and somehow James was even stronger than the previous season. The Cavs convincingly swept the Raptors, with an average margin of victory of 15.3 points, and the main reason for that was the Kings' utter dominance, as he put up averages of 36 points, 8 rebounds, and 5 assists on 57% shooting. And just when you start to think that he's caused them enough misery, James did it again the following season. This time, his Cavs swept the Raptors out of the 2018 semifinals, even without Kyrie Irving. And LeBron did it in iconic fashion, as he averaged 34, 11, and 8 on 55% shooting over the course of the series. Without LeBron's impact, DeRozan would be known today as the man who first took the Toronto Raptors to the NBA Finals. And if DeRozan had done that, then the Raptors management likely never trades him to San Antonio for Kawhi Leonard in the first place, which means Leonard never wins the championship that ended up diminishing DeRozan's legacy. The LeBronto effect wasn't just a few seasons long, but for someone, it had an effect that will last for the entire duration of his career. Last on my list is Michael Jordan, who utterly ruined the legacy of Karl Malone. In my opinion, there is no greater example of a superstar player ruining the legacy of another star. In our reality, with Michael Jordan around, Karl Malone is remembered as one of the greater players to never win a championship. But without Jordan around to hold him back, Malone is legitimately in the argument with Tim Duncan for the title of the greatest power forward of all time. Think about it. The Jazz squared off with the Bulls in the 1997 and the 1998 NBA Finals. In both cases, Jordan iconically defeated Malone and the Jazz to secure his 5th and 6th championship ring. In the process, Jordan made everyone look like a fool who voted for Malone as the MVP in 1997, as MJ immediately outplayed him and hit the game-winning buzzer beater in the first game of the NBA Finals. Without MJ, Malone likely has 2 championship rings, and possibly a Finals MVP or 2. Without MJ, Malone would have finished with 2 league MVP awards instead of 1, which is a total that would have equaled him to the great Tim Duncan. Along with all that, in our reality, Karl Malone has no scoring titles on his resume, but this was entirely Michael Jordan's fault. If you eliminate Jordan out of the picture, then Malone would have won the scoring title in 1989, and in 1990, and in 1991, and in 1992, and in 1997. In this scenario, those 5 scoring titles would give him more than Kevin Durant, Kobe Bryant, and LeBron James. In fact, that would give him the second most in NBA history, trailing only Wilt Chamberlain. Now let's be clear. Michael Jordan was known to stop many superstar players from winning championships and from building their legacies. But there's no question that no player's legacy was hit harder by Jordan's impact than the one they call the mailman, Karl Malone. Every legend of the game had to start somewhere. Some immediately let the world know how great they were, while others left a lot to be desired. So how did your favorite player start his career? Today, we're looking at the Day 1 rookie performances from the NBA GOAT candidates. According to my personal NBA GOAT series, there are a total of 9 GOAT candidates, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, LeBron James, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Tim Duncan, Kobe Bryant, and Michael Jordan. Let's start with Magic Johnson. It came on October 12, 1979, in a road game against the San Diego Clippers. Magic wasn't immediately running the show as the official point guard, as the Lakers star Norm Nixon still held that official position. With that being said, you could still immediately see Magic's style and his excellent point guard tendencies, regardless of the fact that he was starting at the 2 spot. Offensively, Magic had one of the all-time great debut performances as he dropped 26 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, and 4 blocks on 47.6% shooting. But it was the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had the final say, as he hit this iconic skyhook shot as time expired, winning the game 103-102, and the 20-year-old Magic celebrated like they just won the NBA championship. Interestingly enough, as good as Magic was on offense, he was much worse on defense, as he was torched by the Clippers' World B. Free, who dropped 46 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, and 7 steals on 65.5% shooting. Magic never went on to be an all-time great defensive player, but fortunately, he did improve quite a bit after this evening. To follow up Magic, we've got to take a look at Larry Bird. Larry's debut game also came on October 12, 1979, and what was simply an incredible day in the NBA. It may seem hard to believe, but there was once a time where Larry had to earn his minutes, although it certainly didn't last very long, as he efficiently filled up the stat sheet in only 28 minutes, with 14 points, 10 rebounds, and 5 assists on 50% shooting. Unfortunately, there is very limited footage available of this game online, but what you need to know is that Larry was his usual Larry self, and his Celtics got the W over the Houston Rockets 114-106. Next, we'll take a look at Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who at the time was still named Lou Alcindor, but out of respect, I'll still refer to him as Kareem. This debut game was on October 19, 1969, in a home matchup against the Detroit Pistons. Of course, he displayed his artistry with his famous skyhook shot, but he actually scored in a variety of ways this night, as he had an all-around dominant debut game, as he poured in 29 points, 12 rebounds, 6 assists, 3 steals, and 3 blocks on 44.4% shooting. What makes it even more impressive is how he did the majority of his damage while being matched up against the 6'11 Hall of Famer Walt Bellamy, who had no answer for the 22-year-old rookie. This was merely a glimpse of the greatness that he would provide that season, as his Bucks won the game 119-110. Next, we'll take a look at another fundamentally sound big man, Tim Duncan. It was on October 31st, 1997, in a road game against the Denver Nuggets. Coming out of Wake Forest, Duncan was one of the most NBA-ready players that the league has ever seen, as his skills, confidence, and maturity was well beyond his youth. In his debut performance, he led his entire team in minutes, playing a total of 35, and he put up solid numbers of 15 points, 10 rebounds, 2 assists, and 2 blocks on 66.7% shooting. It may not have been as explosive as Kareem's debut, but Duncan's consistency and reliability on both ends of the court was immediately noticeable after just one impressive performance, and as a result, his Spurs won the game with a score of 107-96. Next up, we'll take a look at the extremely young Kobe Bryant. It was on November 3rd, 1996, in a home matchup against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, unlike many of the other GOAT candidates on this list, Kobe was a bit of a slow bloomer, and wasn't having a strong impact as soon as he joined his team. Part of that was the fact that he was fresh out of high school, but the other part was due to his coach Dale Harris not giving him nearly as many minutes as the veteran players. The young Mamba only played a total of 6 minutes. He took 1 shot and he missed it, and had 1 rebound and 1 block to go along with it. I could drag this on, but to put it simply and concisely, the debut of the Mamba was nothing like the assassin that we would eventually know. His Lakers did ultimately win the game with a score of 91-85. Let's take it way back in time and look at who many people consider as the first GOAT candidate, Bill Russell. His debut performance came on December 22, 1956, in a matchup against the St. Louis Hawks. Interestingly enough, St. Louis was actually the team that first drafted Russell, before they traded him to the Celtics, and Russell wouldn't take long to haunt them for that decision. In this debut game, Russell scored 6 points and snagged 16 rebounds and 1 assist on 3 of 11 shooting from the field. Unfortunately, we don't have his defensive numbers on this night, but as usual, he dominated the boards and got the win as he typically does with a final score of 95-93. How about his rival, Wilt Chamberlain? His first game was on October 24, 1959, against a team he frequently abused throughout his career, the New York Knicks. Wilt didn't just dominate New York on this evening, but he arguably had the greatest debut performance of all time, as he put up 43 points, 28 rebounds, and 1 assist on 63% shooting from the field. Even right out of the gates, Wilt was playing all 48 minutes. The Knicks tried to defend Wilt with a rotation of the 6'8 Charlie Tyra and the 6'11 Ray Felix, but neither were an answer for him as the 23-year-old rookie had his way with the New York defense. Obviously, his blocks and steals were not tracked during this era, otherwise this rookie game may have been even more impressive. Next is LeBron James. His first game came on October 29, 2003, in a road matchup against the Sacramento Kings. I'm sure many of you remember watching this game live just like I did, as LeBron was almost certainly the most hyped draft selection that the league has ever seen. And what's quite astonishing is that even as an 18-year-old kid, he lived up to the moment, as he provided plenty of highlights and played solid basketball throughout, putting up 25 points, 6 rebounds, 9 assists, and 4 steals on 60% shooting. For some people who were pessimistic about his ability to live up to the hype, their doubts were immediately squashed after this monstrous display. Regardless of his terrific play, this rookie game went down as the only loss on this entire list, as the Kings ultimately won the game with a score of 106-92. Last on my list of GOAT candidates is Michael Jordan. MJ's first game was on October 26, 1984, in a home matchup against the Washington Bullets. The craziest part about this debut game is Jordan's career nearly ended just as it was getting started, as he had this terrible fall during a dunk attempt. If the angle of his landing had just been slightly different, it could have been a devastating injury to his arm or neck. Remarkably, Jordan not only stayed in the game, but he played 40 minutes on the evening, recording a stat line of 16 points, 6 rebounds, 7 assists, 2 steals, and 4 blocks on 5 of 16 from the field. It was certainly not his most efficient night, but even at this point, the Chicago crowd could certainly recognize his one-of-a-kind athleticism and potential. His Bulls ended up winning the game with a final score of 109-93. So now it's your turn. Of all the games listed on the screen, which one of these debut performances did you find the most impressive or surprising? Every legend reaches its end, but not all finales are created equal. Some legends rode off into the sunset with their heads held high in triumph, while others left the game with just a whimper, wondering if they should have called it quits sooner. Today, we're looking at the greatest basketball artists of NBA history as we analyze their farewell performances and see if any closed out their careers with a masterpiece. According to my personal NBA GOAT series, there are a total of 9 GOAT candidates: Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Tim Duncan, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, and LeBron James. Since LeBron has not yet played his last game, he will not be present in this video. Let's start with the one who most recently retired, Tim Duncan. His final game was on May 12, 2016 in Game 6 of the Western Conference Semifinals against the Oklahoma City Thunder. Famously, Duncan aged gracefully throughout his NBA career, so closing it out with a solid performance didn't come as a surprise. We knew there was a chance that Duncan could retire at the end of that season, but I honestly thought he would be sticking around, as he didn't get the appreciative send-off like Kobe did. With that being said, there are worse ways to go out, as Duncan put up a solid 19 points, 5 rebounds, and 1 block on 50% shooting from the field. Not only was San Antonio one of the oldest teams in the league, but Duncan himself had just recently turned 40 years old, and the much younger Oklahoma City Thunder took full advantage, as they closed out the series in commanding fashion with a final score of 113-99. Next, we'll take a look at the Celtics legend Larry Bird. Bird's farewell performance came on May 17, 1992, in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Semifinals against the Cleveland Cavaliers. At this point, Bird's athletic body was deteriorating fast, as he was now 35 years old and had been dealing with severe back problems for roughly half a decade. Not only that, but Magic Johnson's HIV announcement and absence from the league took a major toll on Bird's sense of motivation, which resulted in Larry deciding to hang it up when he still believed he had some game left in the tank. Due to his chronic back issues, Larry missed roughly 4 of the games that series, but he did play in the deciding 7th game. Larry had a modest contribution, but an efficient one, as he dropped 12 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists on 6 of 9 shooting from the field. It wasn't nearly enough, as the talented Cavs closed out the series with a blowout, as the final score was 122-104. To follow up Larry Legend, of course, we've got to take a look at his rival, Magic Johnson. His final game came on May 2, 1996, in Game 4 of the first round against the Houston Rockets. Although Magic retired after the 1991 finals when he had his HIV announcement, he did actually return for a portion of the 95-96 season. His 4th-seeded Lakers were up against the 5th-seeded and 2-time defending champion Rockets. Magic actually played quite well in his first 3 games of that series, but unfortunately, the 4th game was his worst, as he finished with just 8 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 2 of 8 shooting from the field. He also had 4 turnovers in his 30 minutes of playing time. Ultimately, Hakeem Olajuwon and the Rockets were just too much, as they eliminated Magic's Lakers with a final score of 102-94. Next, we'll take a look at the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. His last game was on June 13, 1989, in Game 4 of the NBA Finals against the Detroit Pistons. This wasn't just a rough game, but a rough series for both Kareem and his Lakers. If they had won this series, it would have given him 7 rings as he rode off into the sunset. But instead, the superior Detroit Pistons swept the Lakers as Los Angeles was dealing with a multitude of injuries, including a hamstring injury to their best player, Magic Johnson. Kareem was known for aging gracefully throughout his career, but on this night, the 42-year-old center just didn't have it, as he was contained to only 7 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists on 2 of 8 shooting from the field. It wasn't as close as the final score indicated, as the Pistons won the championship 105-97. We've looked at enough duds of finales, so let's get into the great performances, starting with Wilt Chamberlain. His last game was on May 10, 1973, in Game 5 of the NBA Finals against the New York Knicks. Wilt's Lakers were competing for championships up to the very end, and despite being nearly 37 years old and playing on a bad knee during the final game of a long season, Wilt still managed to play all 48 minutes. On the night, he put up 23 points, 21 rebounds, 3 assists, 3 steals, and 2 blocks on 56.3% shooting from the field. He was giving a strong effort and was impactful on both ends of the court throughout. But regardless, his Lakers still came up short. Given how many times Wilt destroyed the Knicks throughout his career, it did seem a bit like poetic justice that they got the last laugh, as they won the championship with a final score of 102-93. How about his rival, Bill Russell? Russell's final game was on May 5, 1969, in Game 7 of the NBA Finals against the Los Angeles Lakers. Bill ended his career the same way he played it, winning Game 7s with a clutch effort. He played all 48 minutes and led his team in both assists and rebounds, as he put up 6 points, 21 rebounds, and 6 assists on 2 of 7 shooting from the field. It was a classic battle with the entire 4th quarter available on YouTube. Unfortunately, since it's only the 4th quarter, I can't count how many total steals and blocks he achieved. But even from just the 4th quarter alone, you can see his dominant impact and influence defensively. It's important to remember that not only was Russell leading his team on the court, but he was also the acting head coach, making him the only player coach to lead his team to a championship. If that's not a legendary way to go out, then I don't know what is. Next, we'll take a look at Michael Jordan. Michael's final game was on April 16, 2003, in a road matchup against the Philadelphia 76ers. Obviously, Jordan already had the perfect storybook ending, but that itch to play again was just a little too strong. Instead, his final game was in the regular season, and it was far from his best performance, as he pitched in 15 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 assists on 40% shooting from the field. It was mostly mid-range baskets from MJ, but he did manage to get one last finish at the rim. The game was a blowout in favor of Allen Iverson and the Sixers, to such a point that it was basically over by the third quarter. Due to this, Jordan only played 28 minutes in the game, and the crowd was chanting his name as he was on the bench, since they wanted to see him play more. The final score was 107-87 in a bittersweet ending for his airness. Lastly, we'll take a look at what's becoming the most famous farewell, Kobe Bryant's. This game was on April 13, 2016 against the Utah Jazz. The Lakers were 16-65 at the time they were entering this matchup, but you wouldn't know it considering how hyped Staples Center was on this evening. In his 20th season, Kobe was having a terrible year from an efficiency standpoint, as he was shooting a league worst 35% from the field. But a motivated Kobe would exceed expectations for the occasion. Now this game is pretty highly debated concerning how impressive his performance actually was. After all, the Mamba did have to take 50 shots to score his 60 points, although he did make 44% of those shots. For me, the most impressive part of that night was his finish, as he made his final 5 difficult shots and led his Lakers back from a double-digit deficit when there was only 3 minutes remaining. If Kobe misses any one of those clutch shots down the stretch, he probably loses his final game. With that being said, not every moment was totally legitimate competition. My favorite part was when Kobe completely and blatantly shoved Gordon Hayward away, so he could get some space to get the ball for his final free throws. Kobe's smart. He knew that no matter how badly he shoved Hayward, there's no way the refs are blowing that whistle in that situation. He famously finished his night with 60 points, but he also added in 4 rebounds, 4 assists, 1 steal, and 1 block on 44% shooting, and his Lakers won the game with a final score of 101-96. After making this video, I think it's pretty clear just how special and rare a farewell like this actually is. So now it's your turn. Of all the games listed on the screen, which one of these farewell performances do you think was the most impressive? And explain why it's Kobe. I look forward to reading your comments. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.